Sarah Miller knelt in the frozen mud of a German churchyard and pressed her bare palm flat against her father's coffin. And when the gravedigger told her the plot beside him, the one meant for her, had already been sold to pay his debts, she did not weep. She stood, wiped the dirt from her hands onto her only good dress, and walked to the harbor with nothing but a carpenter's notebook and a promise to herself that no man would ever again decide what she was worth. 6 weeks later, a stagecoach dropped her in the dust of a town that did not want her either. If you feel the weight of what she carried, stay with me until the very end, because this story is going to prove something about the people the world throws away. Please subscribe to the channel. Tap the bell so you don't miss what happens next. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning. Harlan's Crossing sat at the edge of the Nebraska plains, like something the wind had forgotten to finish building. Half the roofs sagged. The church bell cracked 2 winters back, and nobody had the coin to replace it. And the man who might have fixed any of it, James Carter, stood in the doorway of his own carpentry shop, with his right arm hanging useless at his side, staring at a roof he could no longer climb. "Ma'am, this ain't a boarding house," he said, when the woman in the gray traveling coat stopped in front of his shop and simply looked up at the exposed beams above him. "I did not ask if it was," Sarah said. Her accent turned every word careful, deliberate, like she'd built each sentence the way she built everything else, checked twice before it left her mouth. "Your ridge beam is rotted through. 3 feet, maybe 4. It will fail before the first snow." James followed her eyes upward. He'd known about the rot for 2 weeks. He hadn't told a soul because telling a soul meant admitting he couldn't fix it himself anymore, not with a shoulder that screamed every time he lifted his arm past his collarbone. "You a carpenter?" he asked, and he didn't bother hiding the doubt in his voice. "I built barns in Baden before I could reach the top rail of a fence," Sarah said. "I built the roof over my father's workshop when he could no longer climb the ladder. I have built more roofs than most men in this town have built fences." Behind her on the boardwalk, 2 women in bonnets had stopped to stare, and their stares were not curious. They were the kind of stares that undressed a person down to their worst assumptions. One of them, a thin woman with a mouth pulled tight as a drawstring purse, leaned toward the other and did not lower her voice nearly enough. "Would you look at the size of her? What's a woman built like that going to do on a roof besides break it?" Sarah did not turn. She did not flinch. She had heard versions of that sentence in 3 different languages by now, and she had stopped letting any of them land. James, though. James turned his head sharp enough that his shoulder barked in protest, and for a moment something moved behind his eyes that looked almost like shame on someone else's behalf. "That's enough, Mrs. Pruitt," he said. "I'm only saying what the whole street's thinking, James Carter. Then the whole street can keep it to itself." He said it quiet, but it landed like a dropped hammer, and Mrs. Pruitt's mouth snapped shut before she gathered her skirts and moved on with her friend trailing after her like a shadow that had lost its nerve. Sarah watched the exchange without expression, though something in her jaw had tightened just slightly, just enough that a man paying close attention might have noticed. James was paying close attention. It was the first useful thing he'd noticed about a stranger in longer than he could remember. "You didn't have to do that," Sarah said. "Didn't do it for you," James said, though that was only half true, and they both seemed to know it. "Did it because I'm tired of this town deciding things it don't understand. You do not know me either." "No, ma'am, I don't." He looked back up at the roof, then down at his own arm, useless at his side like a tool with a broken handle. "But I know I've got maybe 6 weeks before winter, and a roof that'll come down on my daughter's head if somebody doesn't fix it, and I know I can't climb a ladder anymore without my shoulder giving out. So I reckon what I know about you matters less than what you can do." Sarah studied him for a long moment. Not his face, his hands. Carpenters read each other through their hands, and James Carter's were scarred in the particular way that came from years of honest work, not carelessness. She trusted hands more than she trusted words in any language. "What are you offering?" she said. Not a question exactly. A negotiation. "Room in the loft above the shop. Meals, no wages. I don't have wages to give, not till the roof's done, and I can take work again. Just finish the job and you'll have a roof over your own head till you decide where you're headed next. And if I decide never to leave, James almost smiled. Almost. Then I reckon we'll deal with that when it comes. Sarah looked past him one more time up at the rot she'd spotted from 30 feet away, at the sag in the ridgeline, that told her everything about how this man had been holding his life together with willpower alone, since whatever had happened to his shoulder happened. She thought of her father's workshop back in Baden, the last roof she'd built for a man who could no longer climb, and how that roof had outlived him by exactly 4 months before the bank took the building anyway. I know what a roof is, she said finally, and something in the flatness of it, the certainty, made James Carter step back and let her through the door. She started before sunrise the next morning, and the sound of it woke half the street. Not hammering, not yet. First, she walked the perimeter of the workshop 3 times, notebook open pencil, moving in short, sure strokes as she sketched the roofline, marked the joists, noted every place the old timber had begun to give. James watched her from the doorway with his coffee going cold in his hand, and he did not say a word because he recognized what he was watching. It was the same thing he used to do himself before the accident, before his right arm became a thing he had to think about instead of simply use. You're not climbing up there yet, he said when she finally tucked the notebook into her coat and reached for the ladder. I am climbing up there now, Sarah said. Storm's 2 days off. You don't need to kill yourself getting there first. A roof does not fail on a schedule that is convenient for the carpenter, Sarah said, already 3 rungs up. It fails when it is ready. I would rather be ahead of it than behind. He didn't have an answer for that, so he watched her climb instead, and he noticed the way she moved, not fast, not careless, but sure. Each foot planted before the next one lifted her weight distributed like she'd spent a lifetime learning exactly how much a ladder, a beam, a roof could bear before it complained. Nothing about her was hesitant. Everything about her was measured. By mid-morning, half the street had found a reason to walk past the shop and look up. She's been up there 3 hours, someone muttered. Bet she comes down inside of one more, someone else answered. And there was a meanness in it, a hope almost, that she would fail, because her failing would confirm something they'd already decided about her before she ever climbed the ladder. She did not come down. She worked through the noon heat without pausing for water, until James finally climbed halfway up the ladder himself, wincing the whole way, and held a canteen up until she took it. You don't need to prove nothing to this town, he said. I am not proving anything to this town, Sarah said, drinking. I am building a roof. The town's opinion of me is not load-bearing. James almost laughed. It came out as something closer to a cough surprised out of him. That a German saying? It is a Sarah saying, she said, and handed the canteen back down and climbed back to work before he could figure out whether that had been a joke. His daughter Emma was 7 years old and had inherited exactly none of her father's caution around strangers. She showed up on the 3rd afternoon with a jar of wildflowers and a question that had clearly been building in her since Sarah arrived. Why do you talk like that? Like what? Sarah said, not looking up from the shingle she was setting. Like the words come out sideways. Sarah considered this. Because I learned English after I learned German, and some of the shapes did not want to change. Is German hard? Every language is hard when it is not the one your mother sang to you. Emma sat down on the porch step below the ladder, close enough to talk, but careful, James noticed not to get underfoot the way Emma got underfoot with everyone else in town. Something in Sarah's manner did not invite carelessness. It invited attention. Papa says you're the best carpenter he's seen since Grandpa Carter, Emma announced. Sarah's hand stilled for just a moment on the shingle. Your papa said no such thing to me. He said it to Mrs. Hutchins at the Mercantile. I heard him. Above them, Sarah allowed herself something that was almost a smile. Gone as quickly as it arrived, tucked back beneath the same careful composure she wore like a second coat. She did not comment further. But she worked the rest of that afternoon with something looser in her shoulders, and Emma stayed on the step until supper, asking question after question about chalk lines and straight edges and why a roof needed to breathe, and Sarah answered every single one, like the child's curiosity was the most reasonable thing she'd encountered since stepping off the stagecoach. A roof that cannot breathe rots from the inside. Sarah told her, even while it looks whole from the outside. That is the most dangerous kind of damage, the kind you cannot see. Emma turned that over for a long moment, the way children do when a sentence means more than the words in it. Is that true about people too? Sarah looked down at her surprised into stillness. Yes, she said finally. That is true about people too. The banker came on the fourth day, and everything about his arrival was designed to look like an accident, even though nothing about Elias Crane had ever been accidental in his life. He rode up in a buggy too fine for a town this poor, wearing a coat too clean for a man who claimed to work for a living, and he did not look at the roof taking shape above him so much as he looked at the whole property, the way a man looks at something he has already decided belongs to him. James, he said, tipping his hat with a courtesy that did not reach his eyes. Heard you'd hired some help. Heard right, James said, and did not offer more than that. Didn't know you had the funds for hired help. Don't have funds, got an arrangement. James kept his voice level, but his good hand had curled slightly at his side, the way a man's hand curls when he is bracing for a blow he cannot yet see coming. Crane's eyes drifted up to where Sarah worked, unhurried, methodical, and something in his expression shifted from mild curiosity to calculation. The German woman. That's Miss Miller, yes. Big girl to be up on a roof. James's jaw tightened. She's the best carpenter I've had on this property since my father built it. Didn't say she wasn't skilled, Crane said, smiling the particular smile of a man who has just said something cruel and dressed it as an observation. Said she was big. Nothing wrong with noticing a fact. Above them, Sarah's hammer did not pause, did not even slow, though James would learn later, much later, that she heard every word of it, filed it away, the way she filed away every insult, not to nurse the wound, but to remember exactly who had delivered it in case it ever mattered. You didn't ride out here to talk about my carpenter, James said. No, Crane admitted. I rode out to remind you that your note comes due in 6 weeks. The bank's been patient, James. Your father was a good customer for 20 years, and that buys you some grace. But grace has a limit, and yours is getting close to it. I know when the note's due. Then you know that a half-repaired roof and an unpaid loan don't make for much collateral should it come to that. It won't come to that. Crane's smile widened, unbothered, the smile of a man who had made this exact threat to a dozen other struggling men in this town, and watched every single one of them fail to stop him. I hope you're right, James. I truly do. Harlan's Crossing needs men like you. He glanced up at the roof one more time at Sarah's steady silhouette against the sky before turning his buggy back toward town. Give my regards to your daughter. The words were pleasant. The weight behind them was not, and James stood in his own yard for a long moment after the buggy disappeared, feeling the particular cold that settles into a man's chest when he understands all at once exactly how thin the ice beneath his family has become. Sarah climbed down that evening after the banker's dust had long settled, and she found James sitting on the porch step with his bad arm cradled against his ribs, staring at nothing. Who was that man, she said. Not gentle. Direct the way she was direct about everything. Elias Crane, runs the bank. He threatened you. He reminded me of a debt. That's different. It is not different, Sarah said, sitting down beside him close enough that he could feel the day's heat still radiating off her from hours in the sun. I have met men like him before, in Baden. They speak softly and call it patience, but the softness is only there because they already believe they have won. James looked at her sideways. You sound like you know him personally. I know the shape of him. That is enough. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the roof above them, 3/4 finished now, tight and true, in a way it hadn't been in years. How much do you owe him? More than I can pay in 6 weeks with one good arm. Then we will need less than 6 weeks, Sarah said, as though the arithmetic of it were simple, as though a roof and a debt and a man's whole future were just another set of measurements to be taken and corrected. "You don't owe this town anything," James said. "You sure as hell don't owe me anything. You could finish this roof and keep walking same as you were doing before you ever stopped here." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, long enough that James thought she might not answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped into something quieter, something that carried the weight of every mile she'd crossed to get here. "I buried my father 4 months ago," she said. "The bank in Baden took his workshop 3 days after the funeral. Everything he built, everything I helped him build, gone to a man who never lifted a hammer in his life because a piece of paper said it was owed to him. I did not stop this ladder to save your roof, James Carter. I do not know yet why I stopped, but I know what it looks like when a man like Crane takes something a family built with their own hands, and I find that I am not finished being angry about it." James said nothing for a long while. The evening settled around them purple at the edges, and somewhere inside the house, Emma's voice rose in some private song she was singing to no one. "Well," James said finally, "I reckon I'm glad you're still angry." "Why?" "Because angry people finish roofs before storms." He looked at her, and something had shifted in his face since the morning, some wariness worn away by 4 days of watching her work like the world owed her nothing, and she intended to earn everything anyway. "And because I've got a feeling you're not the kind of angry that burns a person up. You're the kind that builds something." Sarah did not answer that directly, but she did not correct him either, and in the silence that followed, something passed between them that neither one of them had a name for yet. Not trust. Not exactly. Not this early. Something more like recognition. Two people who had both been underestimated by the world in different languages, sitting on the same porch step, watching the same darkening sky. The storm came 2 nights later, early and vicious, the kind of Nebraska storm that turned the sky the color of a bruise and dropped the temperature 20 degrees in the space of an hour. Sarah was still on the roof when the first drops hit. "Get down here!" James shouted from below, his voice cracking with something closer to fear than command. "Sarah, get down now." "Not yet," she called back, and her hands moved faster now, driving the last nails into the section she'd been working since dawn, because she had learned a long time ago that the difference between a roof that survived a storm and a roof that didn't was very often measured in minutes, and she was not going to lose this one to minutes. The wind picked up, dragging at her coat, and the rain came sideways now, and below her, James stood at the base of the ladder with his heart in his throat, watching a woman he'd known for less than a week risk her life on a roof that wasn't even hers to risk her life for. "Sarah." One more beam. Lightning cracked somewhere close enough that the whole sky went white, and in that flash of light, James saw something that stopped his breath entirely. A long crack running through the very ridge beam Sarah was straddling. A crack he hadn't known was there, hadn't seen in 4 days of watching this roof come together. A weakness hidden beneath new shingles that could give way at any second under her weight. "The beam's cracked. Sarah, the beam under you is cracked. Get off it now." She felt it before he finished the sentence, a shift, a give the particular sick lurch of wood, deciding it had reached the end of what it could bear. She threw her weight sideways in the same motion, rolling off the failing beam and onto the section she'd already reinforced that morning, and the crack finished. What it had started a half-second later, a section of old timber giving way, and clattering down into the yard in the driving rain, missing her by less than the length of her own arm. For a moment, neither of them moved. James stood frozen at the base of the ladder, rain plastering his hair to his skull, staring up at where Sarah clung to the reinforced section chest, heaving hands white-knuckled around a beam that, because she had strengthened it that morning, because she had insisted on redoing work no one had asked her to redo, had held. Sarah. Her name came out of him, broken, stripped of everything but raw relief. "I am all right," she called down, though her voice shook now. Finally, the composure cracking just slightly at the edges. "I am all right, James. Get down here. Get down here right now, that's an order." "You do not give me orders," she said, already moving carefully, deliberately toward the ladder despite the storm still raging around her. "But I'm coming down anyway because I'm finished for tonight." She reached the ground and her legs nearly gave out beneath her. adrenaline draining out of her all at once, and James caught her arm with his good hand before she could stumble, steadying her. And for a moment they simply stood there in the pouring rain, close enough that neither one of them was thinking about roofs or debts or the 6 weeks until Crane came calling again. "That beam," James said when he trusted his voice again. "The one that held. You reinforced it this morning. Nobody asked you to. I noticed the wood was wrong 3 days ago. I did not tell you because I did not want you to worry about something I intended to fix. You could have died up there." "I did not," Sarah said simply, "because I fixed it before I needed it fixed. That is the whole of carpentry, James Carter. You fix the thing before it fails, or you spend the rest of your life fixing what breaks instead." He looked at her for a long moment, rain running down both their faces, and something in his chest had shifted so completely in the space of that single storm that he barely recognized the man who had told her 6 days ago that his shop wasn't a boarding house. "I didn't hire a carpenter," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "No," Sarah agreed, and there was no triumph in it, only tired honesty. "You did not." They stood there a moment longer, the storm easing around them, the roof holding fast above the workshop that held everything James Carter had left in the world, and neither one of them said what they were both beginning to understand, that whatever this was, whatever had started with a doubtful offer and a flat, certain reply, it had already become something neither of them knew how to stop. Morning came clear and washed blue, the kind of sky that always followed a Nebraska storm like an apology it didn't quite mean. Sarah was back on the roof before James had finished his coffee, and by the time the street woke properly, half the fallen beam had already been cleared away, and a fresh section of timber was rising to take its place. Mrs. Pruitt found her way to the fence line by mid-morning, drawn by whatever instinct pulls certain people toward the misfortune of others. "Heard the roof near about came down on you last night?" she said, not troubling to hide the hope buried in the observation. "It did not come down on me," Sarah said without looking away from her work. "It came down where I told it to come down because I had already reinforced the section beside it." "Lucky, I suppose." It was not luck. Sarah set another nail, drove it home with a single clean strike. It was work done 3 days before it was needed. "I do not believe in luck, Mrs. Pruitt. I believe in beams." Mrs. Pruitt did not have an answer for that, and after a moment of standing at the fence with nothing left to feed on, she moved along, though not before casting one more look up at the roof, a look that had shifted almost imperceptibly from contempt toward something closer to grudging unease. The story would travel through town before noon. The German woman had stayed on a cracking roof through a lightning storm and never lost her footing once. By the time it reached the Mercantile, it had grown into 3 different versions, and in every one of them, Sarah came out taller than the men telling it. James heard the story secondhand from Mr. Hutchins at the feed store, and when he repeated it to Sarah that evening, something in her expression flickered with an emotion she didn't often let surface. "They are not telling it because they respect me," she said. "They are telling it because it is a good story. There is a difference." "Maybe," James said, "but respect has to start somewhere, even if it starts as a good story." Sarah didn't answer that, but she turned the words over for a long while, after the way she turned over every piece of lumber before she trusted it to bear weight. That was the week she started fixing things nobody had asked her to fix. It began small. She noticed the schoolhouse window frame sagging on her way past one afternoon, the kind of small warp that most people walked past 100 times without ever seeing, and she returned that evening with a plane and a chisel, and had it true again, before the schoolteacher even knew a stranger had been near the building. Then it was the loading platform behind the Mercantile. Its support posts sunk unevenly into ground that had shifted after years of freeze and thaw. She reset 2 of them on a Sunday afternoon while the store was closed and told no one, and the platform stopped its telltale groan within the week. "You can't fix the whole town, Sarah," James told her the 3rd time he caught her walking home with sawdust on her hands and a project she hadn't mentioned already finished. "I am not fixing the whole town," Sarah said. "I am fixing what is broken in front of me. There is a difference between ambition and attention. I have very little of the first and a great deal of the second. Folks are going to start asking who's doing it. Let them ask." She looked at him, and there was something almost amused in the flatness of her expression, a dryness he was beginning to recognize as the closest thing she had to humor. "It will give Mrs. Pruitt something new to discuss, besides my size." James laughed. Really laughed for the first time since she'd arrived, a sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her, and for a moment, the weight of Crane's visit, the debt, the 6 weeks ticking down toward ruin, all of it, seemed to lift just slightly off his shoulders. That night, after Emma had gone to bed and the shop had gone quiet, James found Sarah sitting on the back steps with her notebook open on her knee, though she wasn't writing. She was simply looking at it the way a person looks at something that holds more than what's written on the page. "You don't have to tell me," he said, settling down beside her, careful of his shoulder. "About your father. About Baden. I'm not asking you to. I know you are not asking." Sarah closed the notebook, but she didn't put it away. "That is why I think I will tell you anyway." She told him about the workshop on the edge of Baden, half stone and half timber, built by her grandfather, and expanded by her father, until it was the finest woodworking shop in 3 villages. She told him about learning to read a grain of wood before she could read her letters, about her father's hands guiding hers around the shape of a chisel, about the particular music a well-fitted joint made when it finally seated home. "My mother died when I was 9, she said. After that, it was only my father and me in the shop. He never once told me a girl couldn't do the work. He only told me the work would tell me itself whether I could do it, and it did every single day, and every single day I proved myself to the wood, not to him and not to anyone watching." "What happened?" James asked, though he already knew in the way a man knows the shape of a wound before he sees where it cuts. "He took a loan against the shop the year the harvests failed. Every farmer in Baden took a loan that year. And the bank, the same bank that had lent his father money and his grandfather before, that decided the loan was worth more than the goodwill of 40 years. When my father's heart finally gave out from work, from worry, I do not know which killed him first, the bank did not wait for the ground to settle over his grave. 3 days, James. 3 days, and a man in a clean coat stood in my father's shop with papers that said none of it had ever truly been ours. I'm sorry. I do not want your sorry." Sarah's voice was steady, but something underneath it had gone very still, very controlled, the particular stillness of a person holding something enormous by main force. "I want you to understand why I do not trust a man like Crane when he smiles and calls it patience. I have seen exactly what that patience is worth. It is worth exactly as long as it profits him and not 1 day longer." James was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere out past the yard, an owl called once and went silent. "Is that why you left after the shop was gone?" "There was nothing left to stay for. My father's grave. A room I could no longer afford. A country that had already decided what women my size were good for, which was very little, and none of it involving a hammer." She looked out at the dark shape of the roof against the stars, the roof she had nearly died beneath 2 nights before. "I bought passage with what money I had left after the funeral. I did not know where I was going. I only knew I was not going to stop somewhere and let a man in a clean coat decide again what I had built and what I was owed for building it." And Harlan's Crossing was simply where the stagecoach stopped. She turned to look at him then, and there was something searching in it, something that hadn't been there in the flat, guarded look she'd given him the day she arrived. "I did not plan to stay past finishing your roof." "Do you still plan that?" Sarah did not answer right away. The silence stretched long enough that James thought perhaps he'd asked something he had no right to ask. "I do not know anymore," she said, finally, quiet and honest in a way that cost her something to say. "I have not known any more since the storm." James didn't press her further. He simply sat beside her in the dark, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and let the silence become its own kind of answer. The way silence sometimes could between 2 people who had both learned in different countries and different languages, exactly how dangerous it was to trust too quickly and exactly how much it cost to never trust at all. Elias Crane did not waste his evenings on idle drink the way most men in Harlan's Crossing did. He spent them in the back room of the bank with Judge Hollis, a thin, dry man who owed his position as much to Crane's money as to any election, and together they went over the ledger of every struggling account in town, the way other men might go over a hand of cards. "Carter's roof is nearly finished," Crane said, tapping the page bearing James's name. "Word is the German woman fixed the schoolhouse window too, and the loading platform behind Hutchins' store." "Charitable of her," Hollis said, uninterested. "Not charity, strategy." Crane leaned back in his chair, turning a pen slowly between two fingers. "A town starts to love somebody who fixes things for free, Judge, and that love makes it a great deal harder to take property away from the man she's fixing things for. I don't like it. She's just a carpenter. She's a carpenter nobody in this town can account for. No family here, no papers filed. Shows up on a stagecoach with a notebook and a trunk, and suddenly half the buildings in Harlan's Crossing are sounder than they've been in a decade." Crane set the pen down. "I'd like to know a great deal more about Miss Sarah Miller before her roof gets finished, and James Carter starts feeling too secure to remember what he owes me." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we write a few letters. Immigration offices keep records same as banks do. A woman traveling alone this far west with no family to vouch for her, there's usually a reason a person leaves everything behind and doesn't look back. I intend to find out what James Carter's reason is." Crane smiled the same smile he'd worn in James's yard, pleasant and bottomless. Debts have a way of getting easier to collect once a man understands exactly how alone he really is. Hollis shifted uncomfortable in a way that suggested he still had some scrap of conscience buried beneath his ambition. "And if there's nothing to find, then I'll have wasted a few stamps," Crane said. "But I don't believe in wasting much else, Judge. Not time, not patience, and certainly not opportunity." He looked out the window toward the dark shape of the Carter property, 3/4 visible against the last light of evening, the new roofline standing straight and sure against a sky it hadn't earned the right to trust yet. That roof was supposed to fail. James Carter was supposed to be desperate enough by now to sign whatever I put in front of him. Instead, he's got himself a miracle worker, and I intend to find out exactly where miracles like that come from before this one costs me a foreclosure. Neither man said anything further, but the letter went out 3 days later, addressed to a shipping registry in New York, asking questions about a German woman named Sarah Miller, that Sarah herself did not yet know were being asked. Sarah did not know about the letter, and so the days that followed passed, the way the best days of her life in America had passed so far with sawdust on her hands, and Emma's questions filling the quiet. "Can I try?" Emma asked one afternoon, watching Sarah set a row of shingles along the final unfinished section. "You are 7. Papa says I've got good hands." Sarah considered the child for a long moment, the same considering look she gave a piece of lumber, before deciding what it was good for. "Good hands are not the same as trained hands, but trained hands begin somewhere." She handed down a small offcut of wood and a short nail. "Hold it flat. Do not look at the nail. Look at where you want it to go, and let your hand follow your eyes, not the other way around." Emma's first 3 attempts bent the nail sideways. James, watching from the doorway with a cup of coffee he'd long since forgotten to drink, opened his mouth to intervene to soften the failure, the way a father instinctively wants to soften every failure his child faces. But Sarah caught his eye and gave the smallest shake of her head, and he closed his mouth and let his daughter keep trying. The 4th nail went in true. "There," Sarah said, and there was something warm buried in the flatness of her voice, now something that hadn't been there the day she arrived. "That is carpentry, not the nail going in straight, the failing 3 times and choosing to try a 4th. Emma beamed up at her, sawdust on her cheek, and looked so much like her father in that single unguarded moment that Sarah felt something shift and ache in her chest all at once. Something she hadn't let herself feel since the last time she'd taught small hands to hold a nail steady 4 months and an ocean away in a workshop that no longer belonged to anyone she loved. "You're good with her," James said once Emma had run off to show her mother's old locket, the single nail she'd driven true to anyone in the house who'd admire it. "She is a good student. That makes it easy." Sarah climbed back up to finish the last row of shingles, and James watched her go, and something in his chest had become so thoroughly rearranged over the past 2 weeks that he could no longer remember exactly what shape it had been in before she arrived. The final shingle went in on a Thursday evening, under a sky just beginning to gold at the edges, and Sarah drove the last nail home with a single, unhurried strike. And then she simply sat back on her heels and looked at what she had built. It was without argument the finest roof in Harlan's Crossing. Tighter than it had been under James's father's hand, truer than it had been in 30 years. Reinforced in places no one had asked her to reinforce, because she had looked at the wood and understood the way she understood everything, exactly what it would need to survive whatever came next. James climbed halfway up the ladder to join her, slow and careful of his shoulder, and settled beside her on the ridgeline, looking out over the whole of Harlan's Crossing spread below them in the fading light. The crooked church steeple, the mercantile with its now silent loading platform, the schoolhouse with its true window frame, all of it touched in some small and unannounced way by 2 weeks of a stranger's quiet attention. "You did all this in 14 days, James said. "I had good reason to work quickly." She looked at him sideways, and something passed between them that neither one named. Winter does not wait for slow carpenters. That the only reason? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the darkening town below them, at the life she had not planned to want, and had somehow started wanting anyway. "No," she said finally. "It is not the only reason anymore." James reached over slow, giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted to, and covered her hand with his on the ridge beam between them. The same beam, reinforced and unbroken, that had held her through a storm. Neither of them had expected to survive together. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Below them, Emma's laughter drifted up from the yard, and somewhere across town, a bank ledger sat open on a desk, with Sarah's name written on a letter that had not yet found its answer, and the roof held steady beneath them both, the way good work always holds quietly, without asking anyone's permission to matter. "Whatever this town decides about you," James said quietly, "I already know what I think." "And what is that?" "That I didn't hire help Sarah Miller. I hired the best thing that's happened to this family in years." He looked at her, and there was nothing careful left in his voice, nothing held back. "And I don't much care what Elias Crane or Mrs. Pruitt or anybody else in this town has to say about it." Sarah did not answer in words. But she did not pull her hand away either, and the two of them sat together on the roof she had built with her own 2 hands, watching the last light drain out of a Nebraska sky. Neither one of them yet aware of the letter, already crossing the country toward a truth that would test every ounce of trust they had built in 14 short days. Word of the finished roof spread through Harlan's Crossing faster than any storm had. By Sunday, half the congregation found some excuse to walk the long way past the Carter property just to see it for themselves, tight and true, against a sky that had already tried once to take it down and failed. Mrs. Pruitt was among them, and for once she did not stop at the fence to offer an opinion. She simply looked up at the roofline for a long moment, her mouth pressed into something that was not quite an apology and never would be. And then she walked on, and Sarah, watching from the porch with a cup of coffee, warming her hands, let the silence stand for whatever it was worth. "That's the closest to sorry you'll ever get out of her," James said, coming to stand beside her. "I did not ask for sorry," Sarah said. "I asked the roof to hold. It is holding. That is enough." "Is it enough, I mean?" Sarah considered the question longer than James expected, her eyes moving over the town below the schoolhouse, the mercantile, the crooked steeple. All of it a little sturdier now than it had been the day she arrived. All of it touched by hands that had not asked permission and had not waited for gratitude. 2 weeks ago she had been a stranger stepping off a stagecoach with nothing but a notebook and a promise to herself that no man would ever again decide what she was worth. Now she stood on a porch that had begun without her, quite noticing the exact moment it happened to feel less like a stopping place and more like the beginning of something she hadn't let herself want since the bank took her father's shop out from under his grave. "I do not know yet," she admitted, "but I find that I would like to stay long enough to learn the answer." James looked at her, and something in his face had settled into a kind of quiet certainty that hadn't been there the day he'd told her his shop wasn't a boarding house. "Then stay," he said simply. Whatever comes. Neither of them could see the letter already making its slow way east across the plains, carrying Elias Crane's careful questions toward a truth about Sarah Miller that neither the bank nor the town, nor even James himself had any reason yet to suspect, a truth that would arrive in Harlan's Crossing long before winter did, and would test in ways neither of them could yet imagine exactly how much a roof, a debt, and a promise made on a porch step could actually be trusted to hold. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep with the small crooked nail she'd driven true still clutched in her fist like a coin from some private treasury, Sarah sat alone in the loft above the workshop and opened her notebook for the first time in days. She had not written in it since Baden. It had felt for a long while like the last unbroken piece of a life the bank had otherwise taken apart board by board, too precious to risk filling with anything new. As if new words might somehow crowd out the old ones. Her father's measurements still penciled faintly on the early pages in his careful slanting hand. She turned past those pages, now past the barns and fence lines and roof pitches of a country she would likely never see again, and found a blank sheet waiting near the back. For a long moment she simply held the pencil above it, unmoving the way she held a chisel above a fresh board before the first cut when the wood could still become anything. Then she wrote a single line, small and precise, the way she measured everything Harlan's Crossing. 14 days. The roof holds. She looked at it for a long while, before closing the notebook and setting it beside her bed, not locked away in the trunk this time, but left out where the morning light would find it first. Somewhere below her, she could hear James moving through the dark house, checking a window latch, pausing outside Emma's door, the way he did every night before he finally let himself rest. It was such a small thing, that pause, that small ritual of a father making certain his daughter was safe before he allowed himself to stop working. Sarah had watched her own father do the same thing once, years and an ocean ago, and she had not expected stepping off a stagecoach into a town that did not want her to find that particular kind of tenderness again, in a country that had given her so little reason to look for it. She did not know, lying in the dark with the sound of James's footsteps fading toward his own room, that a letter was already crossing 3 states to ask questions about exactly who she was and exactly why she had left everything behind to end up here. She only knew that for the first time, since her father's coffin had been lowered into ground, the bank no longer let her call her own. She had built something that held in a place that was beginning, despite every instinct that told her not to trust it, to feel almost like it might one day be home. 3 days after the roof was finished, Elias Crane received an answer to his letter, and it was not the answer he had wanted. The shipping registry in New York had no record of a Sarah Miller arriving from Bremen that matched the description he'd sent, no manifest with her name clean and legible in the columns where such things were kept. There was instead a name crossed out and rewritten on a passenger list dated 3 months back. Sarah Muller corrected in a clerk's hurried hand to Miller, the kind of small clerical accident that happened to half the immigrants passing through Ellis Island every week and meant nothing at all. Crane read it twice, looking for something that wasn't there, and found instead the shape of his own disappointment. But disappointment for a man like Crane was never the end of a plan. It was only the beginning of a different one. "Nothing," Judge Hollis said, reading over his shoulder. "You spent good money on stamps for nothing." "Not nothing." Crane folded the letter and set it aside, already turning the shape of a new idea over in his mind, the way another man might turn a coin. A crossed-out name on a ship's manifest doesn't prove anything criminal. But it doesn't have to prove anything, Judge. It only has to raise a question. And a town frightened enough by a question will do most of my work for me. You mean to spread it around. I mean to let it spread itself. There's a difference, and it's a difference that matters if anyone ever asks who started it. Crane smiled the same unhurried smile he wore into every room he meant to burn down slowly. All I have to do is mention over a friendly game of cards that the German woman's papers don't quite match her name. The rest of Harlan's Crossing will take it from there. Fear travels a great deal faster than the truth does, and it doesn't need my signature on the way out the door. He was as good as his word. By the following Sunday, the whisper had already made its way from the card table at the saloon to the pews of the church, and it had grown teeth on the way. the way whispers always did in a town with too little to talk about and too much time to talk about it. "Heard her papers don't match her name," Mrs. Pruitt murmured to the woman beside her during the closing hymn, not troubling to lower her voice below the reach of the pew in front of her. "Heard the name on the ship don't even match the one she goes by." "You don't say." "I do say." Elias Crane himself looked into it. "Man like that wouldn't spread a rumor without cause." Sarah heard none of it directly. She did not attend church, had not been raised to trust buildings that asked for money in exchange for grace. But James heard it secondhand from 3 different people before noon, each version a little more damning than the last. Until by the time the story reached him for the 4th time, it had transformed Sarah Miller from a carpenter with a small clerical mismatch on a shipping manifest into something closer to a fugitive. He found her behind the workshop that afternoon, sharpening a chisel against a whetstone, with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, and he stood there a moment before he found the words for what he needed to ask. "Sarah." "Yes." "Is there something about your papers I should know?" Her hands stilled on the whetstone. She did not look up right away, and in the pause before she did, James felt something cold settle low in his stomach, the particular dread of a man who has begun without quite admitting it to himself to need someone's honesty more than he's ever needed anyone's honesty before. "What have you heard?" she said finally, and her voice had gone very careful, very flat, the same flatness she'd worn the day she stepped off the stagecoach and told a stranger she knew what a roof was. "That your name on the ship's manifest doesn't match the name you go by." That Crane looked into it. Sarah set the chisel down. When she looked up at him, there was no fear in her face, only a tired, weary kind of resignation. The look of a woman who has been made to explain herself too many times in too many languages to too many men who had no right to ask. "My name was written Mueller when I boarded," she said. "The clerk in Bremen misheard it or misspelled it or did not care enough to ask twice. I do not know which, and it did not matter to me at the time, because I was burying my father's memory in a harbor, and a clerk's spelling was the smallest of my concerns. Miller and Mueller are the same name, James. One is simply easier for American tongues to hold on to. I did not lie. I did not hide anything. I only let a mistake stand because correcting it would have cost me a day I did not have to spare." James let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "That's it. That's the whole of it. That is the whole of it." Something flickered across her face, then something sharper than the resignation had been. "But it will not matter to this town whether it is the whole of it. A question once asked loudly enough becomes its own kind of answer. Crane understands this. It is why he asked it. Then we go into town," James said, "and we tell them the truth ourselves before Crane gets to tell it his way to one more person. You cannot fight a rumor by chasing it, James Carter. You will only give it more rooms to live in. So what do? Sit here and let him turn this whole town against you?" Sarah picked the chisel back up and her hands returned to their slow, deliberate work against the stone, though something in the set of her shoulders had gone rigid in a way it hadn't been a moment before. "We finish what we started. We let the work speak the way it has been speaking since the day I climbed that ladder. A rumor cannot stand very long against a roof that does not leak. That's not going to be enough this time. You didn't hear the way Mrs. Pruitt said it. Half the church looked at you like you'd already been convicted of something. Half the church looked at me like that the day I arrived before Crane ever wrote a letter to New York," Sarah said, and there was an edge in it now, something worn thin by 2 months of being looked at that way in a country she had crossed an ocean, hoping might look at her differently. "I did not come to Harlan's Crossing to be liked, James. I came because a stagecoach stopped here and I needed a roof over my head. If this town wants to believe the worst of me because a banker wishes it to, there is very little I can build that will change their minds faster than their own fear will unbuild it." James was quiet for a moment, watching her work the chisel with hands that did not shake, even now, even with the whole weight of a town's suspicion pressing down on her. "I'm not going to let him do this to you. You cannot stop a man like Crane from doing what he intends to do, James. You can only decide what you intend to do in return." She set the chisel down again and looked at him directly, and there was something almost gentle beneath the steel of it now. "And I already know what you intend, because I have watched you defend me at the fence line, and on the porch, and in front of half this street since the day I arrived. You do not need to prove it to me again. Maybe I need to prove it to myself." James said quiet, and something passed between them that neither one of them tried to name this time either, though it sat closer to the surface now than it had on the roof 2 weeks before. The mercantile was crowded the next morning when Sarah walked in for a length of rope and a box of nails, and the crowded room went quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has been talking about the same person, and that person has just walked through the door. She did not slow. She walked to the counter and set down her list, and Mr. Hutchins took it from her with hands that were not quite steady, glancing once toward the back of the store where a cluster of women stood pretending very hard to examine a bolt of gingham they had already examined twice. "That'll be $1.10, Hutchins said, not meeting her eyes. "Is there a problem with my money, Mr. Hutchins?" "No, ma'am, no problem." But there was a problem, plain as the sweat gathering at his collar, and Sarah understood exactly what shape it took even before Mrs. Pruitt found her courage at the back of the store and let it loose across the room. "Some folks are wondering," Mrs. Pruitt said loud enough to reach every corner of the mercantile, "whether we ought to be doing business with somebody whose papers don't hold up to scrutiny." The room went stiller still. Sarah turned slow and looked at the older woman with an expression that had nothing soft left in it. "My papers," Mrs. Pruitt held up to a clerk in Bremen and an officer at Ellis Island, both of whom had considerably more authority to judge them than you do. "I built the roof over your neighbor's head with my own 2 hands. I fixed the schoolhouse window your grandchildren look through every morning. I have asked nothing of this town except to be left to my work. If that is not enough for you, then perhaps the problem is not my papers." "Well, I never." "No," Sarah agreed, cutting her off with a calm that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. "I do not imagine you have. That may be the trouble." She paid her $1.10, took her rope and her nails, and walked out of the mercantile with her spine straight and her chin level. And it was not until she was 3 streets away out of sight of the store window that her hands finally began to shake. The fear she had refused to show inside finally allowed its moment, now that no one was watching to see it. James found her there, sitting on an overturned crate behind the blacksmith, staring at her own trembling hands like they belonged to someone else. "Hutchins told me what happened," he said. "I am fine." "You don't look fine." "I am fine," Sarah said again, sharper this time, and then quieter, honest in the way she only allowed herself to be honest with him now. "I am tired, James. I am tired of being made to defend the size of my body and the sound of my accent and the spelling of my own name in every town I have ever tried to build a life in. I did not think it would follow me across an ocean. I was foolish to think that." "It's not going to follow you here," James said. "Not if I've got anything to say about it." "You cannot promise that." "No," he admitted. "But I can promise I'm not going to stand quiet while a man like Crane decides who gets to belong in this town and who doesn't. I've stood quiet about a lot of things in my life, Sarah. I'm done standing quiet about this one." Crane's next move came faster than either of them expected, and it did not come wrapped in the pleasant courtesy of a hat tip in the yard. A notice arrived of the Carter property 3 days later, delivered by a boy from the bank who would not meet James's eyes as he handed it over, and James read it twice, standing in his own doorway, before the words fully settled into meaning. "He's calling the note early," James said, and his voice had gone flat with the particular shock of a man watching solid ground reveal itself as thin ice. "Says a clause in the original loan lets him call it due on 90 days written notice if he believes the collateral's at risk. 90 days, Sarah, not 6 weeks. 90 days from a notice he's dated 3 weeks back, which means we've got less than 5 weeks left to raise the whole sum, not the 6 I thought we had." Sarah took the paper from him and read it herself. Slow, careful. The way she read everything, and something in her expression hardened into the particular stillness she wore when she was working out the shape of a problem before she let herself feel anything about it. "This clause," she said. "Show me where it says collateral is at risk." James pointed to a paragraph near the bottom, dense with legal language designed to be skimmed past rather than read. Sarah read it 3 times. "This does not say what he claims it says," she said finally. It says the bank may call the note early if the value of the collateral has demonstrably declined. Your roof is finished, James. Your property is worth more today than it was the day you signed this loan, not less. He has no grounds to invoke this clause. Try telling that to Judge Hollis. I intend to. Sarah folded the paper with brisk, angry precision. A man like Crane relies on people being too frightened or too unlettered to read his own contracts against him. He does not expect a carpenter to understand a legal clause. He is about to learn that a woman who has spent her whole life reading the grain of wood for hidden weaknesses is entirely capable of reading a contract for the same thing. James looked at her with something between disbelief and the beginning of hope, an expression that had become almost familiar on his face in the weeks since she'd arrived. You can read contracts too. My father did not let a bank take everything from him without a fight the first time, Sarah said, and something bitter moved behind her eyes. I read every page of that loan alongside him back in Baden, though it did not save the shop in the end. The bank found other ways, uglier ways when the words on the page would not serve them. But I learned. I learned exactly how these men build their traps out of language most people are too tired or too trusting to read closely. She looked up at him. I will not make the same mistake twice, James. Not with your family's roof over my head. They rode into town together that afternoon and found Judge Hollis alone in his office above the bank, hunched over a stack of papers he did not look eager to be interrupted from. Judge, James said, setting Crane's notice on the desk between them. I want to know how a clause about declining collateral applies to a roof that got finished 2 weeks ago and made this whole property worth more, not less. Hollis did not pick up the paper right away. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he already knows the answer about and does not want to say out loud. Mr. Crane believes there are other factors affecting the property's value, he said finally. What other factors? The uncertainty surrounding your hired carpenter's papers. A property's value isn't only in its timber, Mr. Carter. It's in the stability of the household, the reliability of the people attached to it. Hollis still would not quite meet either of their eyes. If there are questions about Miss Miller's legal standing, a bank might reasonably view that as a risk to the michimi. That is a lie built to sound like law, Sarah said, and her voice cut through the room with a precision that made Hollis flinch. My legal standing has never been questioned by any authority with the power to question it. Only by a banker who invented a rumor and is now using his own rumor as evidence against the very man he is trying to ruin. You know this, Judge Hollis. I can see that you know this. Hollis's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke again, and something in his face had gone gray, the particular gray of a man forced to look at his own complicity in daylight. I have a great deal riding on my relationship with Mr. Crane, Miss Miller. I am not in a position to simply... You are in exactly the position to simply, Sarah said. You are the one man in this town with the authority to say that a clause has been misapplied. Whether you use that authority is a choice judge, not a circumstance. I understand that choosing correctly may cost you something. I am asking you to consider what it costs the rest of us when you choose incorrectly. The office fell silent. Outside, the ordinary sounds of the street carried up through the window, a wagon, a dog barking. Someone's laughter cut short by the turn of a corner, and inside 3 people sat with the whole weight of a family's future balanced on the willingness of one frightened man to do the smallest, hardest thing a person could do, which was simply tell the truth to someone who did not want to hear it. I'll need to review the clause more carefully, Hollis said finally, which was not agreement, but was not refusal either, and Sarah understood the way she understood the grain of a board before she ever put a blade to it, that this was the most they were likely to get from him today. Thank you, Judge, she said, standing. I trust you will review it carefully and correctly. They left him there with his gray face and his stack of papers, and neither of them spoke again until they were well clear of the bank's shadow. You think he'll actually stand up to Crane? James asked. I think he is frightened of Crane and ashamed of himself in equal measure, and I do not know yet which feeling will win, Sarah said. But I planted the shame there today. Sometimes that is the only seed a person like Hollis will accept. Emma came home from school 2 days later with dried tear tracks on her cheeks and refused to say a word about why until James finally coaxed it out of her over supper. Billy Pruitt said Sarah's a criminal. Emma said, her small voice trembling with an anger too big for her body. He said his mama said she's got a false name and she's going to jail and Papa's going to lose the house because of her. James's fork went still against his plate. Across the table, Sarah's face had gone carefully, deliberately blank, the mask she wore whenever something struck close enough to hurt. I told him he was wrong, Emma went on. I told him Sarah built the whole roof and fixed the school window, and she's the best carpenter in the whole entire world, and he pushed me down in the yard and said I didn't know anything because my papa was stupid enough to trust her. He pushed you. James's voice had gone dangerously quiet. I'm fine, Papa. I pushed him back harder. Despite everything, there was a flicker of fierce satisfaction in that admission, quickly swallowed by the tears threatening to return. But it's not fair. None of it's fair. Why does everybody hate her just because she talks different and she's big and she's not from here? Sarah reached across the table then and covered Emma's small hand with her own. The same gesture James had offered her on the roof passed forward now to someone even smaller and even more in need of it. It is not fair. Sarah agreed, quiet and honest, because she had never once lied to this child and did not intend to start now. The world is very often not fair, Emma, and people who are frightened will sometimes look for someone smaller than their fear to blame it on. But you do not have to let their unfairness become your own. You only have to keep being exactly as brave as you were today, defending what you know is true, even when it costs you something. Did it cost you a lot? Being brave, I mean, when people were mean to you before. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and something old and tired moved behind her eyes. Yes, she said finally. It cost a great deal, but I have found that the alternative, becoming small enough that no one has reason to notice you, costs even more over the whole of a life. I would rather be seen and disliked by people who do not know me than be safe and invisible to everyone, including myself. Emma considered this with the particular gravity children bring to ideas too large for them, and then she climbed out of her chair and wrapped her arms around Sarah's neck without warning, fierce and sudden, and Sarah went very still for a moment, unused to being held by anyone in a very long time, before her arms came up slowly to return the embrace. James watched the two of them from across the table. His daughter and the woman who had become something far larger than hired help stand together, and something settled into place in his chest that felt less like a decision than like a fact he'd simply been too slow to notice until now. He was in love with her. He had been for weeks, probably, if he was honest with himself, and he had simply been too consumed with roofs and debts and a banker's slow campaign of ruin to name it properly, until his daughter put her arms around Sarah's neck and Sarah's whole guarded face softened into something he had never seen it wear before. Elias Crane's second letter arrived from Baden itself, forwarded through 3 different offices before it finally reached his desk, and this one gave him considerably more than a misspelled name on a passenger manifest. It gave him a name, Sarah Muller, attached to a report filed with the local magistrate 11 months prior, describing an altercation at a workshop on the edge of town between a young woman and an agent of the Bavarian Trust Bank sent to enforce an eviction. The agent, the report noted, had sustained a broken wrist and 2 cracked ribs. The young woman had struck him with a length of scrap timber when he attempted to physically remove her from a building she refused to leave, while her father's body was still being prepared for burial inside it. No charges had been formally pursued. The magistrate's notes suggested the bank had quietly decided a public trial would draw more unflattering attention to their conduct than it was worth. But the report remained on file, unresolved, a loose thread that had simply been left to fray rather than properly cut. Crane read it 3 times, with something close to delight moving behind his eyes. Well, he said to no one alone in his office with the letter spread flat on his desk. There it is. He did not need her convicted of anything. He only needed the story, the shape of it. The image of a large foreign woman striking a bank's agent hard enough to break bone. An image that would travel through Harlan's Crossing a great deal faster and a great deal uglier than the truth of a grieving daughter defending her father's deathbed from a stranger's hands ever would. Truth was slow and complicated. Fear was fast and simple. Crane had built his entire career on knowing exactly which one a frightened town would choose to believe. He rode out to the Carter property himself the following evening, timing his arrival for the hour when the whole family would be gathered on the porch after supper, because a man like Crane understood that cruelty landed hardest when it had an audience. "James," he said, tipping his hat with the same false courtesy he always wore. "Miss Miller, lovely evening." "Say what you came to say, Crane," James said, standing. "Straight to business. I respect that." Crane reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, holding it loosely, almost carelessly, the way a man holds something he knows he does not need to grip tightly because its power does not depend on force. "I received some interesting correspondence from Baden this week. Seems your Miss Miller has a bit more history than a misspelled name on a ship's manifest." Sarah's face had gone very still, very pale beneath the evening light, and James saw something in her expression he had not seen before. Not the composed calm she wore against Mrs. Pruitt's insults, not the tired resignation from the mercantile. This was fear, real and unguarded, the fear of a woman watching her worst memory turned into a weapon in someone else's hand. An assault, the report says, against a bank official performing his lawful duty. Crane's voice was almost gentle, which made it worse. Broken wrist, cracked ribs, struck him with a piece of lumber, apparently. I wonder what the good people of Harlan's Crossing would make of learning they've been sleeping soundly under a roof built by a woman with a violent history and an unresolved criminal report waiting for her back in Germany. "You don't know the whole of what happened," James said, his voice shaking with a fury he was fighting hard to keep leashed. "I don't need to know the whole of it, James. I only need the town to know the part that frightens them." Crane refolded the paper and tucked it back into his coat. Unhurried, savoring the stillness he'd created on the porch. "Here is what I propose. You sign over the note tonight, a quiet voluntary transfer of the property, no foreclosure proceedings, no public spectacle. In exchange, this letter stays in my desk drawer where no one in this town ever has to read it. Refuse and I'll have it read aloud at the next town meeting in front of your daughter, in front of every neighbor whose good opinion you've spent 2 months rebuilding. Your choice, of course. I only deal in choices, James. I never make a man do anything he doesn't ultimately decide for himself." The porch had gone utterly silent, the ordinary evening sounds of the yard swallowed up by the weight of what had just been laid down between them, and Sarah sat with her hands clenched tight in her lap, staring at a man who had just taken the worst night of her life and turned it into a blade aimed at everything she had begun foolishly to believe she might finally be allowed to keep. Crane rode off into the gathering dark without waiting for an answer, confident as men like him always were, that fear needed no immediate reply to do its work. It would simply sit there on the porch after he'd gone, growing heavier by the hour, until it crushed whatever resistance had been standing against it. Emma had been sent inside before the worst of it, but her small face still appeared in the window once watching before James caught her eye, and she retreated, and it was that glimpse, his daughter's frightened face pressed to the glass, that finally broke something loose in him. "Tell me," James said, turning to Sarah, once Crane's dust had settled on the road. "Tell me what actually happened, all of it. I don't care what Crane's letter says. I want to hear it from you." Sarah did not answer right away. She sat with her hands still clenched in her lap, staring out at the dark yard, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of its usual careful control left in it. "My father died in the night," she said. "I found him in the morning still in his workbench chair as though he had simply fallen asleep over a project he never finished. I had not even sent for the undertaker yet. His body was not yet cold, James, when the bank's agent arrived with papers and 2 men to help him carry out whatever furniture he decided the bank was owed. He told me to step aside. I told him my father was still in the room. He said the debt did not care whose body was in the room, and when I would not move from the doorway, he put his hands on me to move me himself." James's jaw had gone tight enough to ache. "And you hit him." "I picked up the nearest piece of wood and I hit him, yes. I do not know if I would do it differently now. I have turned that morning over 10,000 times since it happened, and every time I turn it over, I find the same answer waiting underneath, that I would rather have broken every bone in that man's hand than let him drag my father's chair out from under his own body while it was still warm." Her voice cracked finally, the composure she had guarded through 2 months of insults and suspicion giving way all at once. I did not run because I was guilty, James. I ran because I understood in that moment exactly how little the truth would matter once a bank decided which story it wanted told. I have watched that lesson prove itself true twice now, once in Baden, and once tonight on this porch in this country. I crossed an ocean believing might finally judge me by my hands instead of by other people's fear of them. James reached for her, then both hands. This time careful of nothing except the need to close whatever distance remained between them. I believe you, he said. Every word of it. And I am not signing that note, Sarah. Not tonight, not ever. Not to protect a secret that was never a crime to begin with. If Crane wants to stand up at a town meeting and read that letter aloud, then he can stand there and watch me tell this whole town exactly what kind of man sends 2 agents to drag a grieving woman away from her dead father's body. They will not believe you over him, not all of them. Enough of them will choose the frightening story, because the frightening story is easier to believe than the sad one. Maybe, James said. But I've spent 35 years letting this town's opinion decide too many things I should have decided for myself. I'm done doing that. Whatever they choose to believe, I know what's true, and Emma knows what's true, and I'd rather stand in front of every soul in Harlan's Crossing and lose this property honestly than sign it over quietly to a man who builds his whole fortune out of other people's fear. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving across her face in the near dark. And for the first time since the stagecoach had dropped her in the dust of this town, she let herself lean into another person's certainty instead of standing alone against the whole weight of the world by herself. Then we do not sign, she said quietly. We finish this the way we finished the roof, together and honestly and before the storm arrives, rather than after. Neither of them noticed Emma slip back to the window, watching her father and the woman who had become something far larger than hired help stand together in the dark hands, still joined facing down a threat. Neither one of them yet knew how to survive, only that surviving it, whatever it cost, would have to happen in the open, now in front of the whole town, with nowhere left to hide the truth that had followed Sarah Miller across an ocean, and finally inevitably caught up with her. They did not sleep much that night. Long after Emma had finally drifted off with her small hand still curled around the crooked practice nail she kept like a talisman, James and Sarah sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp burning low between them, working through what little they could control in a situation built almost entirely out of things they couldn't. Hutchins might stand with us, James said, turning the idea over slowly. He's seen what you've done for this town firsthand. So might Reverend Cole if it comes to a public meeting. Man's not fond of Crane, whatever his congregation might whisper on a Sunday. And if they do not, then we tell the truth anyway and let whoever wants to believe it, and whoever doesn't. I'm not asking this town's permission to trust you, Sarah. I already do. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, giving her the same space he'd given her on the ridge beam weeks before. I'm only asking you to let me stand next to you when Crane tries to make you stand alone. Sarah looked at their hands close but not touching the lamp, throwing long shadows across the table between them, and something in her chest ached with a feeling she had spent 4 months in an ocean trying not to let herself want again. The particular dangerous relief of being someone's in the smallest and largest sense of the word, after believing for so long that she had used up whatever share of belonging life intended to give her. In Baden, she said quietly, I promised myself I would never again let a man's decision determine what I was worth. I have kept that promise for a long time, James Carter, by keeping every door half closed and every hand at arm's length. I do not know how to let someone stand beside me without also letting them have the power to leave. I'm not asking for power over you, James said. I'm asking to be trusted with it and to prove I won't misuse it, same as you proved yourself on that roof the first week you were here. That's all trust ever is, near as I can tell. Somebody handing you something breakable and watching to see if you'll drop it. Sarah's hand moved the last few inches across the table, and this time she was the one who closed the distance, her fingers settling over his steady, despite everything the evening had cost her. Then do not drop it, she said, and it was not quite a warning, and not quite a plea. but something honest sitting in the narrow space between the two. "I won't," James said, and meant it with the whole of whatever certainty a man could offer after a night like this one, with a threat hanging over his family's roof and a town's judgment still undecided, and nothing ahead of them but the hard work of proving in daylight in front of everyone that the truth was worth more than the fear a banker had spent 2 weeks carefully building out of it. Outside, the lamp's glow was the only light left burning in Harlan's Crossing. Small and steady, against a night that had grown considerably darker than either of them had expected it to. And somewhere beyond the dark fields, Elias Crane slept easily in his fine house. Certain the way men like him were always certain that fear would finish the work he had started long before the sun came up to complicate it. Morning came gray and unhurried without any of the drama. The night before had seemed to promise, and Sarah was on the porch before James woke, sitting with her notebook open on her knee, writing for the first time in days. She was not sketching a roofline this time. She was writing out in careful, deliberate English every detail of that morning in Baden, exactly as it had happened: the chair, the papers, the agent's hands on her before she'd ever raised the length of wood in her own, because she had decided somewhere in the last hour before dawn that if Crane intended to stand in front of this town and tell her story for her, she would make certain there was a truer version already written down and ready to stand against his. James found her there when he came out with 2 cups of coffee, and he didn't ask what she was writing. He simply set 1 cup down beside her and sat and let her finish the sentence she was in the middle of before either of them spoke again. "You're going to read that out loud," he said finally. "Not a question. If it comes to that, yes." Sarah closed the notebook, but kept it near the way she'd kept it near every day since the night the roof held through the storm. "I have spent 4 months letting other people's version of my worst day decide what I was allowed to be afraid of. I find I am finished with that arrangement." Crane's not going to back down easy. "No," Sarah agreed. "He is not. But neither, I think, am I." She looked out at the yard, at the roofline standing solid and true against the pale morning sky, at the whole small stubborn life she had built here in 8 short weeks out of nothing but sawdust and honesty, and a willingness to fix what was broken in front of her without waiting for anyone's permission to do it. "Whatever happens at that meeting, James Carter, I intend to walk into it exactly as I walked into your yard the first day I arrived. As myself. Nothing hidden. Nothing softened for anyone's comfort but my own." James looked at her for a long moment. Coffee going cold and forgotten in his hand, and understood with a clarity that had been building in him for weeks and had finally settled into something unshakable overnight, that whatever Elias Crane thought he held over this family, he had badly misjudged the woman he was trying to use it against. "Then I'll be standing right beside you when you do it," he said. And Sarah, for the first time since the letter had arrived, allowed herself something that was almost finally a real and unguarded smile. Crane did not wait for James to request a meeting. He called one himself, posting a notice at the Mercantile and the church door within 2 days, and the wording of it was carefully, deliberately cruel. A public discussion, it said, regarding certain concerns about the character and legal standing of persons currently residing on the Carter property. He had not written Sarah's name. He had not needed to. Every soul in Harlan's Crossing knew exactly who the notice meant. "He's rushing it," Sarah said, reading the posting over James's shoulder in the gray early light. 2 days is not enough time for the truth to travel as far as the rumor already has." "That's the point," James said. "He wants us walking into that meeting hall with half the town already decided before we open our mouths. Then we will have to make certain the half that has not decided hears us first." They spent those 2 days the way they had spent every hard thing since the storm together, without wasted motion, dividing the work the way they divided every job on the property. James rode out to Hutchins and Reverend Cole, laying the truth in front of both men, plainly, without dressing it up prettier than it deserved to be. Sarah wrote and rewrote the account in her notebook until the words carried exactly the weight she needed them to carry. No more, no less the same discipline she brought to every joint she'd ever cut clean on the first try. Emma, for her part, spent both evenings drawing pictures of the roof on scraps of butcher paper, adding more detail each night: the schoolhouse window, the mercantile platform. Small houses she'd invented that Sarah had supposedly fixed too. And when James asked her what she meant to do with them, she simply said, "I'm going to show everybody what she really is." With a certainty that made both adults go quiet for a long moment. The meeting hall was already crowded by the time they arrived. Every bench filled latecomers standing along the back wall with their arms crossed, and their opinions, most of them already fixed in place. James walked in with Sarah at his side, and Emma's small hand gripped tight in his other, and the room's noise dropped by half the moment the door swung shut behind them. Crane stood at the front, composed, unhurried, a folded paper waiting in his breast pocket, like a blade he had already decided the exact moment to draw. "Neighbors?" Crane began. Once the room had settled, his voice pitched to carry warm and reasonable, the voice of a man who had built a career, convincing rooms he had their best interests at heart. "I called this meeting with a heavy heart. Some of you have heard whispers about the woman working on James Carter's property. I felt it my duty as a man entrusted with this town's welfare to make certain those whispers were either put to rest or properly addressed." "Get to it, Elias," Hutchins called from near the front, arms crossed, and there was no warmth in the way he said the name. Crane's smile did not falter. "I intend to." He drew the folded paper from his coat, unhurried, and the whole room seemed to lean forward half an inch at once. "I have here a report forwarded from the German authorities in Baden, detailing an assault committed by a woman named Sarah Mueller, going by Miller in this town, against a bank official performing his lawful duties. Broken wrist, cracked ribs. A woman with a documented history of violence, gentlemen sleeping under the same roof as James Carter's young daughter." The room erupted into exactly the noise Crane had been counting on. Gasps, murmurs, Mrs. Pruitt's voice rising above the rest, with something close to triumph in it. Emma's small hand tightened in James's grip, and Sarah stood very still beside him, her spine straight, her chin level, letting the noise wash over her without flinching, though James could feel through the hand he'd placed at the small of her back exactly how much that stillness was costing her. "That's not the whole of it," James said loud enough to cut through the noise, and the room quieted, slow and reluctant, more curious than convinced. "Elias Crane read you half a story because half a story serves him better than the whole one does. I'd ask this town the courtesy of hearing the rest before it decides anything." "The facts are the facts, James," Crane said, still pleasant, still unhurried. "A broken wrist doesn't change shape depending on who's telling the story." "No," Sarah said, and her voice, when it finally came, carried farther than anyone in the room expected it to, steady and clear, despite everything trembling beneath the surface of it. "But the reason for it does. And I intend to tell this town the reason myself in my own words, since Mr. Crane has already shown he is willing to tell it in his." She walked to the front of the hall, past Crane, past the rows of faces she had spent 2 months learning to read, the way she read the grain of a board, and she opened her notebook to the page she had written and rewritten until every word carried exactly the weight it needed to. "My father died in his workbench chair," she said. "On a morning I had not yet found the courage to grieve properly, because within hours of finding his body, a bank's agent arrived to seize the workshop that fed us both for 20 years. I asked him to wait until my father's body had left the building with some dignity. He told me the debt did not care whose body was in the room. When I would not step aside from the doorway, he put his hands on me to move me by force." The hall had gone utterly silent. Now the earlier murmurs swallowed whole by the particular quiet a room falls into when it senses it is hearing something true. "I struck him with a piece of scrap lumber," Sarah went on, her voice steady, even as her hands gripping the notebook were not. "I do not deny it, and I have never once denied it to myself in the 11 months since. I broke his wrist. I am not proud of the violence in it, but I have never once been ashamed of the reason for it, and I will not let a man who has never buried anyone he loved in his life stand in front of this town and tell you that story as though it were a crime against a stranger's property rather than a daughter's last act of protecting her father's body from men who valued a debt more than they valued the dead." Mrs. Pruitt's face had gone through several colors in the last minute, none of them comfortable. Somewhere near the back, a woman Sarah didn't recognize had begun quietly crying, one hand pressed to her mouth. "That is a moving story," Crane said, recovering his composure faster than the room around him. "But it does not change the facts of the assault, nor does it explain why she concealed it from this town, nor why she travels under a name that is not strictly speaking her own." "I did not conceal it," Sarah said, turning to face him directly for the first time. "I simply was never asked until you decided to ask this whole town instead of asking me. And Miller is Muller, Mr. Crane, spoken the way an American clerk chose to spell it. You know this. You have known it since your own letter came back from New York confirming it. You built an accusation out of a language barrier, because the truth on its own did not frighten anyone enough to serve your purpose." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Uncertain now, the room's earlier hunger for scandal souring into something closer to unease. And it was into that uncertain quiet that Judge Hollis rose from his seat near the front, his face pale, but his spine for once straight. "There's something else this town ought to hear," Hollis said, and his voice shook slightly. The voice of a man forcing himself through a door he had spent weeks too frightened to open. Elias Crane called James Carter's note early, citing a clause about declining collateral. "I reviewed that clause this week at Miss Miller's insistence, and I find no honest reading of it that applies to a property whose value has, if anything, increased since the loan was signed." "Judge Hollis," Crane said. And for the first time that evening something sharp had crept into his pleasant voice. "I'd remind you that your position depends considerably on this bank's good opinion. I'm aware of exactly what my position depends on." "Elias," Hollis said, and something had settled into his face now. Something that looked almost like relief at finally saying it. "I've spent 3 years signing whatever you put in front of me because I was afraid of what happened to men who didn't. I watched you do this to the Whitfields 2 years back. Call a note early over a clause that didn't hold water, same as you're trying now, and I signed off on it because it was easier than standing up to you. I'm not doing that again tonight, not in front of this whole town." The hall erupted a second time, but the shape of the noise had changed entirely. No longer scandal, but something closer to outrage. Several voices rising at once, someone near the back shouting that the Crane family had done the same thing to old Pete Larkin's ranch 3 winters past, forged signatures and all, and the whole meeting hall seemed to tip all at once from a trial of Sarah Miller into something far more dangerous for the man who had called it. Crane's composure finally cracked. "This is exactly the kind of hysteria a town works itself into when it lets sentiment outweigh sense," he said louder now, edges showing through the pleasant veneer he'd worn into the room. "I have done nothing this bank was not legally entitled to do." "Then produce the original loan documents," Sarah said, "and let this town's own eyes decide whether the collateral clause was applied honestly or whether you altered the terms after the fact, the way you altered the terms on my father's loan in Baden, before you and men exactly like you ever set foot in America." The accusation landed harder than she had perhaps intended it to, and Crane's face for just a moment showed something underneath the smile that he had clearly not meant to let the room see. Not confusion, not innocence, but calculation, fast and cold. The look of a man deciding in real time how much of the truth he could afford to let stand uncontested. "I don't have to produce anything," Crane said. "Not to a room full of farmers and a foreign carpenter with a documented history of striking bank officials." "Then produce it to me," came a new voice from the back of the hall, and every head in the room turned as one toward the door, where a man in a dust-covered traveling coat stood with a leather satchel under one arm, his badge catching the lamplight as he stepped forward. "United States Marshal Cole Ashford. I've been riding the circuit 3 weeks investigating complaints of forged loan documents and predatory foreclosure across 2 counties. Elias Crane's name has come up in 4 separate complaints so far. I'd be obliged if somebody in this room could point me toward his office ledgers before the night's out." The color drained clean out of Crane's face, and for the first time since Sarah had met him, standing composed and untouchable in James's yard. 8 weeks ago, Elias Crane looked like a man who had run out of rooms to smile his way out of. "This is absurd," he said, though the conviction had gone out of his voice entirely. "I run a legitimate bank. I have run this bank for 11 years without so much as a formal complaint. 4 complaints in 2 counties says otherwise. Mr. Crane, the marshal said unhurried, crossing the room with the easy confidence of a man who had walked into far more dangerous rooms than this one and come out the other side just fine. Whitfield Ranch, Larkin Spread, 2 others further south. I expect you recognize the names of better than this town does. I'd be obliged if you'd stay put while I have a look at those ledgers Judge Hollis just mentioned. You have no authority to search my bank on the word of a judge who's clearly frightened himself into fabricating grievances. I have a federal warrant that says otherwise. The marshal said, producing it from his satchel without breaking stride. Signed 3 days ago in the county seat on evidence considerably more solid than one judge's fright. I'd suggest you make this easy on yourself, Mr. Crane. Man in your position tends to find things go better for him when he doesn't make a United States Marshal chase him through a crowded room. For one long suspended moment, Crane looked as though he might do exactly that. His eyes cut toward the door, toward the horse tied outside, toward whatever thin chance remained of riding clear of Harlan's Crossing, before the weight of 11 years finally caught up with him, and the whole hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which choice he'd make. He did not run. Whatever else Elias Crane was, he was not in the end a man built for the indignity of being chased down in front of a town he had spent over a decade convincing to fear him. He straightened his coat instead, with the particular stiff dignity of a man trying to salvage some scrap of composure on his way out the door, and said nothing further, and the marshal's hand closed firm around his upper arm, and together they walked out of the meeting hall into the dark street beyond, leaving behind a room that did not know for several long seconds quite how to fill the silence he'd left in his wake. It was Emma in the end who broke it small and clear, and utterly without irony, tugging on her father's sleeve to ask in the sudden hush, "Does this mean Sarah gets to keep the roof?" A ripple of surprised, exhausted laughter moved through the hall. The particular laughter that comes after fear finally lets a room go, and James picked his daughter up, despite his bad shoulder's protest, and held her close, and looked across the small distance to where Sarah stood, still holding her notebook against her chest, like a shield she no longer quite needed. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, voice thick with something that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite tears either. "I reckon she does." The meeting did not end so much as it dissolved, the formal proceedings forgotten in the wake of what had just happened. Neighbors clustering into small, urgent knots of conversation about Crane, about the Whitfields, about Pete Larkin's ranch, and how many other families in the county might have quietly lost land to the same slow, patient cruelty that had nearly cost James his roof. Mrs. Pruitt, of all people, found her way over to where Sarah stood, and for a long moment simply stood there working her mouth around words that did not come easily to her. "I was wrong," she said, finally, stiff and unpracticed the way a person says something they have never once had cause to say before. "About you. I let a banker do my thinking for me, and I ought to have known better watching you work that roof through a storm that would have sent most men running." "Thank you," Sarah said, and there was no triumph in it, only a tired, careful grace. That could not have been easy to say. "No," Mrs. Pruitt admitted. "It wasn't." She hesitated a moment longer, then added almost gruffly, "My fence has been leaning 3 years now. If you ever find yourself with a slow afternoon—" "I will look at it," Sarah said. And something that might have been the beginning of an understanding passed between the two women. Not friendship yet, but the first plank laid toward something that might one day become it. James found Sarah near the back of the emptying hall. A few minutes later, Emma finally handed off to Reverend Cole's wife for a moment, so the two of them could stand together without an audience for the first time since Crane's letter had arrived on the porch. "You did that," James said. "All of it. I just stood there." "You stood beside me," Sarah said. "That was not nothing, James Carter. I have stood alone through a great many rooms like that one. Tonight I did not have to." He reached for her hand, the way he had on the ridge beam, the way he had across the kitchen table. Except this time there was no hesitation left in it at all, and when she did not pull away, he closed the last distance between them and kissed her careful and unhurried. The way he did everything with his bad shoulder and his whole careful heart. And Sarah, who had spent 4 months and an ocean convincing herself she had no room left for wanting anything beyond survival, found that she wanted this with a force that startled her. "I meant what I said on the porch," James murmured when they finally parted. "Whatever this town decides, I already know what I think of you." "And what is that?" Sarah asked, though she already knew, though she had known for weeks now, watching him defend her at fence lines and church notices, and finally tonight in front of the whole weight of a town's judgment. "That I love you," James said, simple and unadorned, the way he built everything without ornament, without anything held back. "Been loving you longer than I let myself admit, if I'm honest. Didn't want to say it while Crane's shadow was still hanging over us. Didn't want you thinking I was only saying it out of gratitude for the roof. I do not think that," Sarah said, and her voice had gone unsteady in a way it rarely allowed itself to be. "I have not thought that for weeks, James Carter." She paused, gathering the words the way she gathered every important thing, carefully, deliberately. "I love you also. I did not intend to. I intended only to finish a roof and continue moving the way I had moved through every town since Baden. You made that considerably more difficult than I planned for." James laughed low and real and kissed her again. And outside the meeting hall, the last of the crowd dispersed into the cool dark of a Nebraska night that had, for the first time in 8 weeks, nothing left in it that either of them needed to fear. They rode home well past midnight, Emma asleep against James's shoulder the whole way, and the property looked different somehow in the moonlight, not smaller, the way it had looked the day Sarah first saw it from the dusty street. But settled solid, the roofline a clean black silhouette against a sky finally scrubbed clear of everything that had threatened it. James carried Emma up to bed himself despite his shoulder's complaints, and Sarah waited on the porch looking up at the roof she had built with her own hands, thinking of Baden, of her father's chair, of every mile of ocean and prairie that had brought her against every reasonable expectation to exactly this porch on exactly this night. "She's down," James said, coming back out, settling beside her on the step. "Didn't even stir when I laid her in the bed. Big night for a 7-year-old. "Big night for all of us," Sarah said. They sat together a while longer, not talking, simply existing in the same quiet space. The particular ease of two people who no longer needed constant words to fill the silence between them. And it was nearly 1 in the morning, both of them finally beginning to feel the pull of sleep when Sarah's head came up, sharp nostrils flaring. "Do you smell that?" James lifted his head, and the moment he did, he smelled it too. Smoke, sharp and close, far too close to be drifting in from some distant chimney. "The shop?" Sarah said, already on her feet. "James, the shop." They rounded the corner of the house together and found the back wall of the workshop already catching flame, licking up along the timber siding near the woodpile. Too fast, too deliberate to be an accident, and in the flickering orange light, James caught the retreating shape of a man on horseback tearing away from the property at a dead run. "That's Crane's man!" James shouted, recognizing the build even in the dark. One of the 2 rough hands who'd ridden with Crane on his visits, the kind of men who did the parts of a banker's business a banker preferred not to be seen doing himself. "Sarah, get the buckets." "No time for buckets on that much flame," Sarah said, already moving her mind, working the way it worked on a rotted beam fast, certain cataloging exactly what needed to happen and in what order. "The well pump now, and the horse blankets from the barn. Wet them and beat back the base before it reaches the roof timbers. That roof is new. James, it will not catch as easy as the old siding, but only if we stop it low before it climbs." They worked side by side in the firelight, the way they had worked through the storm 2 months before. Soaked blankets slapping against flame, the well pump groaning under James's good arm, while Sarah hauled bucket after bucket at a pace that would have exhausted a man half her size. And for several long, terrible minutes, neither of them knew whether the fire or their own strength would give out first. "It's spreading toward the corner post," Sarah shouted over the roar of it, and James saw what she meant. The flame had found a gap in the old siding and was climbing fast now, angry, hungry, reaching for the fresh timber of the roof she'd spent 2 weeks building with her own hands. The roof that had survived a lightning storm and a banker's cruelty, and was now facing down one final desperate act of revenge from a man who had already lost everything else he'd tried to take from them. "We're not losing this roof," James said, and there was something fierce in his voice now, something that matched the fire itself for sheer unwillingness to yield. "Not after everything it cost to build it. Emma's small voice cut through the chaos then, and both of them turned to see her standing in the yard in her nightgown, woken by the noise, her face lit orange by the flames. And for one heart-stopping moment, James's whole world narrowed down to nothing but the terror of his daughter, standing too close to a fire that had not yet decided how large it intended to become. "Emma, get back to the well trough and stay there, do you hear me?" James's voice cracked with a fear that had nothing to do with the fire, and everything to do with the small frightened face standing too near it. And Emma, to her credit, did not argue, scrambling backward toward the safety of the stone trough without a word of protest, her wide eyes never leaving the flame, licking up the side of the only home she had ever known. Sarah threw another soaked blanket against the base of the fire, and this one seemed finally to catch the flame in a way that mattered, smothering a wide swath of the burning siding, down to smoke and hiss rather than open fire. But the corner post was still burning stubborn, climbing toward the eave, where the new roof met the old wall. "The axe!" Sarah shouted. "James, the axe! We need to open the siding below the eave, cut it away before the fire reaches the roofline." James didn't question her, didn't waste the breath to ask why a carpenter's instinct in the middle of a blaze made more sense than his own panicked urge to simply throw water at whatever burned brightest he'd learned over 2 months. Exactly how much to trust the certainty in her voice. When she gave an instruction like that, the same certainty that had held a beam together through a lightning storm and held a whole town's judgment at bay in a crowded meeting hall. He found the axe by feel, more than sight, and Sarah took it from him without breaking stride, swinging hard and true into the burning siding, opening a gap between the flame and the fresh timber above it, starving the fire of the fuel it needed to keep climbing. "Water now on the gap, quickly!" James threw the last of the pump water into the opening she'd cut, and the hiss of steam that rose up was the most beautiful sound either of them had heard all night. The fire's hungry climb finally decisively broken, reduced in the space of a few frantic minutes from a roaring threat to a smoking, defeated ruin along the lower half of the workshop wall. They stood there afterward, both of them soot-streaked and soaked through chests, heaving, watching the last embers die out along blackened timber that would need weeks of repair, but had not in the end taken the roof. The roof itself standing untouched above the damage, dark and solid against the stars. Exactly as sound as it had been the moment Sarah drove the final nail home. "You saved it," James said when he finally trusted his voice. "Again, we saved it," Sarah corrected, breathing hard, the axe still gripped tight in one soot-blackened hand. "I did not do that alone, James Carter. I have not done anything alone since the day you offered me a room and no wages in exchange for a roof neither of us knew yet how much it would end up costing either of us." Emma came running back across the yard the moment the flames died low enough to seem safe, throwing herself against her father's legs, then against Sarah's, refusing to let go of either of them. And for a long moment, the three of them simply stood together in the smoking, dripping wreckage of the night, alive and whole, and considerably more bound together than any of them had been 24 hours before. But even as the fire died, its meaning did not. Someone had ridden out from that meeting hall with murder in their intentions. Someone who worked for a man now sitting in a marshal's custody. And whoever it was had vanished into the dark prairie with a torch and a grudge and no guarantee at all that tonight's failure would be the last attempt made against the family who had finally publicly brought Elias Crane's long reign of quiet cruelty into the light. James looked out at the dark tree line where the rider had disappeared, jaw set, one arm wrapped tight around his daughter, the other reaching instinctively for Sarah's soot-blackened hand, and understood with a certainty that settled cold and clear beneath the adrenaline still roaring through him that whatever safety they had won inside that meeting hall tonight, the fight for it was not yet in any real sense finished. Marshal Ashford rode back out to the property at first light, alerted by Reverend Cole, who'd seen the orange glow against the sky from his own window, and roused half the town before realizing the fire had already been beaten back on its own. He walked the perimeter of the scorched siding with a slow, methodical attention that reminded Sarah oddly of the way she herself walked a roofline before ever picking up a hammer, cataloging every detail before drawing a single conclusion. "Coal oil," he said finally, crouching near the base of the burned wall, rubbing a pinch of blackened residue between two fingers. Somebody didn't want this to look accidental, but they didn't much care whether folks knew it was deliberate either. That tells me it was rage more than planning. A man thinking clearly doesn't leave coal oil residue this obvious. You know who did it, James said. It wasn't a question. I've got a fair guess. One of the two men who used to ride with Crane on his collection rounds didn't show his face at the jail this morning when I went looking to ask him some questions about those forged Whitfield documents. Man matching his description was seen riding hard out of town, round about the same hour your fire started. Ashford straightened, brushing off his hands. I'll have riders out looking for him by noon. Man like that panicked and running tends not to get far or stay quiet for long. And Crane? Sarah asked. Sitting in the county jail as we speak, considerably less pleasant company than he was at that meeting last night from what I hear. Something almost like grim satisfaction moved across the marshal's face. Ledger's Judge Hollis handed over confirmed forged signatures on at least 3 properties. Yours included, Mr. Carter, plus 2 others I hadn't even connected to him yet before last night. He's not walking free from this, whatever his lawyer tries to argue. Man like that always believes he's smarter than the paper trail he leaves behind him. They rarely are. James let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since the flames first caught some of the night's terror, finally beginning to loosen its grip on his chest. So it's over. The banking's over, Ashford said, careful in the particular way of a man who did not like giving people false comfort. The man who set that fire is still out there somewhere, and until my riders bring him in, I'd keep a careful watch on this property after dark. Desperate men do desperate things, especially once they realize their protector isn't coming to save them from the consequences of what they've done. He tipped his hat to Sarah, a gesture that carried none of the false courtesy Cranes had always carried, and mounted up to ride back toward town, leaving the 3 of them standing amid the scorched and dripping wreckage of a night that had cost them a wall, and given them in its place something considerably harder, to burn a town that had finally seen the truth clearly enough to choose the right side of it. A debt exposed and broken beyond Crane's power to enforce, and a family, however unconventional its shape, that had held together through fire, the same way it had held together through storm. But somewhere out on the dark prairie, a frightened, furious man rode on without direction or plan, carrying with him the particular danger of someone who had already lost everything and had nothing left to lose by finishing what he'd started. Emma tugged at Sarah's sleeve once the marshal's dust had settled on the road, her small face still smudged with soot. She'd gotten helping carry water buckets. She was really too small to carry. Are we going to be okay? Sarah crouched down to the girl's level, ignoring the ache in her own smoke-scorched lungs, and looked at her with the same steady honesty she had given her from the very first afternoon on the roof. I do not know everything that is still coming, Sarah said. I would be lying if I told you I did, but I know this roof held through a storm that should have brought it down, and it held through a fire meant to burn us out of everything we have built. I know your father does not run from what frightens him, and neither I have learned do I. Whatever is still out there, Emma, we will face it exactly the way we have faced everything else, together and with our eyes open. Emma considered this with the same grave seriousness she brought to every hard truth Sarah had ever handed her, then nodded once, satisfied, and wrapped both arms around Sarah's neck, the way she had at the supper table days before, fierce and certain, and James watched the 2 of them from a few feet away, exhausted and soot-stained, and undeniably, irrevocably a family, now in every way that mattered. Whatever danger still rode unresolved, somewhere out past the tree line, in the pale, uncertain light of morning. The man who set the fire made it 11 miles before his horse threw a shoe on a rocky stretch of the county road, and left him stranded on foot in open country, with nothing but a half-empty canteen and a growing understanding of exactly how much trouble he'd bought himself. Marshal Ashford's riders found him by mid-afternoon, hunkered in a dry creek bed, too exhausted and too frightened to put up any resistance worth the name. Gave it up without a fight. Ashford told James and Sarah that evening, riding back out to deliver the news himself rather than send word through the town grapevine. Turned out he wasn't half so loyal to Crane as Crane liked to believe. Started talking before we'd even got the cuffs properly latched, told us Crane promised him a share of the Whitfield land once the foreclosure went through, Clean told us about 2 other fires set on properties further south that nobody'd ever connected to arson before now. Man's trying to buy himself a lighter sentence by handing over everything he knows. Judge is going to have a busy season from the sound of it. So it's finished, James said. And this time there was no hesitation in the words, no careful qualifier waiting behind them the way there had been the morning after the fire. Far as this property's concerned, yes. Ashford glanced up at the repaired section of wall fresh timber standing pale and obvious against the older weathered boards around it. Crane's looking at years, not months, once the circuit judge finishes going through everything Hollis handed over. And the fellow who lit that fire will be sitting a good long while himself, wherever they send him. Neither one of them is going to be troubling this family again. Sarah let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding in one form or another since the night the flames first caught. Thank you, Marshal. For everything. Wasn't just me, ma'am. Ashford tipped his hat, the same easy, unhurried courtesy he'd shown the whole town since he first walked through that meeting hall door. Town like this needed somebody willing to stand up and say the truth out loud before I ever got here. Way I understand it, that was you mostly. He swung back up onto his horse. Word travels, Miss Miller. I expect you'll find folks in 3 counties know your name by the time the circuit judge finishes his business with Crane. Try to enjoy the quiet while it lasts. The quiet, when it finally arrived, did not feel like an ending, so much as it felt like the first true beginning either of them had been allowed in a very long while. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither James nor Sarah had known in months. Mornings spent repairing the scorched wall, the fresh timber going up clean and true. Under Sarah's steady hands, James finally able to do more of the lifting himself, as his shoulder slowly, stubbornly began forgiving him for the accident that had taken so much of its strength the year before. He would not say what had changed. Sarah suspected, though she never pressed him on it, that some of it had less to do with the shoulder itself, and more to do with a man finally putting down a weight he'd been carrying alone for a very long time. You're moving that arm further than you were a month ago. She observed one afternoon, watching him hoist a beam into place, with only a small wince, where before there would have been a sharp, involuntary gasp. Doctor always said it might come back some with time and use, James said. I stopped believing him a while back. Didn't see much point in hoping for something that wasn't happening. And now, he considered the question, turning the beam over to check its fit before answering. Now I've got more reason to want it back than I did before. Man wants 2 good arms around the people he loves. Sarah didn't answer that directly, but something in her chest ached in the good way now, the way a muscle aches after work. Well done, rather than work forced past its limits. And she found herself more and more often these days, simply watching him instead of finding some task to busy her hands with while he worked. It was a strange, unfamiliar luxury, watching someone without the old reflex to immediately look away before her looking was noticed and judged. Emma, for her part, had appointed herself official supervisor of the repair work, dragging a small stool out to the yard each afternoon after school to sit and offer opinions neither adult had asked for, but both found themselves more often than not actually taking. That board's crooked, she announced one day, pointing at a section James had just leveled. It is not crooked, James said. Sarah, is it crooked? Sarah studied it with exaggerated care. It is very slightly crooked, Emma. Your father's eye is not as good as yours yet. Traitor, James muttered, though he was fighting a smile as he reset the board, and Emma preened with the particular satisfaction of a 7-year-old whose expertise had just been publicly validated by the only adult in the county she considered a true authority on the subject. Word of what had happened at the meeting hall traveled through Harlan's Crossing, the way all things traveled through a small town, fast and thoroughly, and with a fair amount of embellishment along the way, and the change it worked on. How people looked at Sarah was not immediate, but it was steady, the way a slow thaw is steady each day, a little warmer than the one before it, without any single moment marking the turn. Mrs. Pruitt made good on her promise about the fence within the week, appearing at the property with a basket of preserves she insisted was simply extra from her cellar, and not under any circumstances an apology dressed up as neighborliness. The fence is round the back 40, she said, businesslike, refusing to meet Sarah's eyes for longer than it took to hand over the basket. "No hurry, whenever you've got a spare afternoon." "I have this afternoon," Sarah said, and Mrs. Pruitt's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "You don't have to drop everything for it." "I do not mind." Sarah was already reaching for her tools. A fence left leaning too long forgets how to stand straight even after it's fixed. Better to catch it while it still remembers. Mrs. Pruitt watched her work for the better part of an hour, and somewhere in that hour, without either woman quite marking the shift, the silence between them stopped, being wary, and became something closer to companionable. Two women from very different places finding in the shared language of fixing what was broken a common ground neither had expected to reach. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Pruitt said finally, watching Sarah reset the last post. "A proper one, not just fixing a fence and calling it even." "You do not owe me anything, Mrs. Pruitt." "I do, and we both know it, so let me say it plain. I judged you the first day you stepped off that stagecoach, and I kept right on judging you for 2 months after, and every single thing I judged you for turned out to be exactly backward from the truth. You weren't the danger to this town." The banker smiling at all of us over his desk was. She folded her arms uncomfortable, but determined to finish what she'd started. "I'm sorry, there. Said properly this time." Sarah straightened, wiping her hands on her trousers, and looked at the older woman for a long moment. "Thank you," she said simply. "I did not need the apology to keep working, Mrs. Pruitt, but I will not pretend it does not matter to hear it." The schoolhouse held a small gathering the following Sunday. Nothing grand, just cider and biscuits, and the whole of Harlan's Crossing's children running wild through the yard, while their parents stood in loose clusters, talking about crops and weather, and more quietly about everything that had happened at the meeting hall, and the schoolteacher, a thin, serious woman named Miss Abernathy, who had never said more than a polite good morning to Sarah in 2 months, sought her out near the cider table, with something almost like nervousness in her manner. "I wanted to thank you properly," Miss Abernathy said, "for the window frame. I never did find out who fixed it until the meeting, and I've felt poorly about never saying thank you at the time. It needed fixing. I happened to notice it needed fixing. That is the whole of the story." "It's not though, is it?" Miss Abernathy glanced toward where Emma was chasing another child through the grass, breathless and laughing, in a way James said she hadn't laughed nearly enough of before Sarah arrived. "You've been quietly holding this whole town together for 2 months, while half of us were too busy being frightened of what we didn't understand to notice. I'd like the children to know that. I'd like to teach them that kindness doesn't always announce itself, and the person doing the most good is very often the person everyone was quickest to doubt." Sarah didn't have a ready answer for that which was James thought watching from a few feet away with a cup of cider in his good hand, becoming something of a rare and precious occurrence. Sarah Miller, careful and measured in every word she'd ever spoken to him, briefly, genuinely, at a loss for what to say. That night, once Emma had fallen asleep clutching a biscuit she'd insisted on saving for morning, James found Sarah on the porch again, notebook closed beside her, looking out at a town that had finally slowly stopped looking at her like a stranger. "You've gone quiet," he said, settling beside her. "I am thinking." "About?" Sarah was silent for a long moment, choosing her words the way she chose every board before she cut it. "I have never stayed anywhere longer than a season, James. Not since Baden. I finish the work, and then I move because staying has always seemed like a kind of risk I could not afford. The risk of building something, a bank or a fire, or simply time itself could take away from me again. I do not know how to want a place the way I am beginning to want this one. I am not certain I remember how." "Nobody's asking you to remember all at once," James said. "I'm not asking you to promise me forever tonight. I'm only asking you to notice that you're still here weeks after that roof was finished, weeks after you had every reason and every excuse to keep moving the way you always have. That's not nothing, Sarah. That's you already choosing whether you've let yourself say it out loud or not." She looked at him, something vulnerable moving behind the careful composure she still wore like armor most days. "And if I choose it out loud, and then something takes it from me again, I do not know if I can build myself back a third time. Baden took everything once. I rebuilt in a stranger's town with nothing but a notebook. If this town, if any of it, then we rebuild it together, James said, cutting gently through the fear before it could finish articulating itself. That's the whole of what I'm offering Sarah. Not a promise that nothing bad ever happens again. I can't promise you that nobody can. Just a promise that whatever does happen, you won't be facing it with only a notebook and a train ticket this time. You'll be facing it with a family that already proved this month alone it doesn't run from fire or storms or bankers. Sarah's eyes had gone bright in the porch lamplight, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, simply reaching for his hand, the way she had reached for it across the kitchen table weeks before. Except there was nothing tentative left in the gesture. Now nothing held carefully in reserve. I would like that, she said finally, quiet and certain. I would like to stay James Carter. Not because the roof needs finishing, and not because there is nowhere else for me to go. Because I have found somewhere in these 2 months that I would rather build a life here with you and Emma than build anything else anywhere else alone. A letter arrived from the county seat 10 days later, official and formal, in a way that felt almost anticlimactic after everything that had led to it, confirming what Marshal Ashford had already told them in person. Elias Crane had pleaded guilty rather than face a jury with Judge Hollis's ledgers laid out against him, accepting a sentence of 8 years for fraud and forgery across 3 counties, his bank's assets seized and placed under a court-appointed trustee until the various families he'd wronged could be made whole, so far as the law was capable of making anyone whole after that kind of theft. James read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then set it down and looked at Sarah with something like disbelief still lingering at the edges of his relief. 8 years. It's really over. It is over in the way the law can make it over, Sarah said. It will take longer for this town to fully believe it, I think. Fear does not leave as quickly as it arrives, but yes, it is over. The trustee's letter included a second piece of news. Neither of them had expected a formal notation that the note on the Carter property, along with several others Crane had manipulated, was to be considered satisfied in full. The fraudulent early call voided the original terms, reinstated, at a rate James could actually manage on a carpenter's honest income. It was not forgiveness of the debt entirely. It was, James said, reading it over a third time close enough to breathing room that he hardly recognized the feeling in his own chest. We should celebrate, he said. We are sitting at a kitchen table reading a legal letter, James. This is already how carpenters celebrate. He laughed and reached for her hand across the table, the gesture so familiar now between them that neither one thought twice about it anymore. Not good enough. Not for this. I want to do something Emma will remember, something this whole family will remember, not just another quiet evening at the table. Sarah considered this something warm, moving behind her usual careful composure. The roof, she said finally. We built it together. Let us celebrate on it together, the 3 of us, the way we finished it the first time. That evening they climbed the ladder as a family. James steadier now on his feet than he'd been in over a year. Emma scrambling up ahead of both of them with the fearless confidence of a child who had spent 2 months watching a stranger become the person she trusted most outside her own father and Sarah. Last notebook tucked into her coat, out of long habit, though she had no intention of measuring anything tonight. They sat together on the ridgeline as the sun went down over Harlan's Crossing. The whole town spread out below them, quieter and safer than it had been in years. Every roof and window and platform Sarah had touched, standing a little sturdier for her having passed through. Tell me a story, Emma said, leaning against Sarah's side. About Baden, about your papa's shop, before all the bad stuff. Sarah was quiet a moment, but it was not the guarded quiet of the woman who had first stepped off the stagecoach 2 months ago. It was simply the quiet of someone deciding where to begin a story she had finally truly made peace with telling. My father used to say a good roof was a promise, she said. A promise to whoever slept beneath it that the world outside could rage as hard as it liked, and they would still wake up dry and warm and safe. He built that promise into every roof he ever raised, and he taught me to build it into mine. She looked out over the town, the family gathered close around her, the life she had never planned to want and had somehow, against every hard lesson Baden had taught her, ended up choosing anyway. I did not understand until I came here that the promise was never only about the roof. It was about who you built it for, James had been turning something over in his coat pocket for the better part of the evening, and it was not until Emma had finally grown drowsy enough to be carried down and settled into bed, leaving the two of them alone on the roof, under a sky gone fully dark and thick with stars, that he finally worked up the nerve to take it out. "I had this made in town last week," he said, holding out a small ring, plain and unadorned, forged from a horseshoe nail by the blacksmith down the street, because James hadn't wanted to wait for anything fancier to be shipped in from the county seat. "Figured a carpenter would appreciate something built by hand more than something bought pretty in a catalog." Sarah looked at the ring, then at him, and for a long moment said nothing at all. The particular stillness she wore when something mattered too much for an immediate answer. "James Carter, are you asking me to marry you on the roof I built? Seemed like the right place. You built this roof with your own two hands when this town wanted nothing to do with you. I figured it was only fitting to build the next part of our life starting right here too." He turned the ring over once in his fingers, suddenly less certain than he'd sounded a moment ago. "I know it's not much of a proposal. I'm not a man of many fine words, Sarah. Never have been. But I know what I want, and what I want is you, and Emma wants it too. Not that her opinion carries much legal weight, but she'd tell you the same if she were awake to say it herself. She would." Sarah agreed, something bright and unsteady in her voice now. "She has told me several times this week already, in fact in the way only a 7-year-old can manage to make a hint sound like a legal notice. So what do you say?" Sarah reached for the ring, turning it over in her own hands, examining the simple, honest work of it, the way she examined every piece of craftsmanship that crossed her path, not for polish, but for soundness, for whether it had been made true. "Yes," she said finally, simple and certain, the same way she had told him on the very first day that she knew what a roof was. "Yes, James Carter, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger, with hands that weren't entirely steady, despite 2 months of steady work rebuilding a roof and a life alongside her. And when he kissed her this time, there was nothing careful left in it at all, nothing held back for fear of what tomorrow might undo. Only the plain, hard-won certainty of two people who had built something together strong enough finally to trust. Word of the engagement spread through Harlan's Crossing almost as fast as the rumor about her papers had months before. Except this time the whispers carried nothing but warmth in them, and within the week, 3 separate families had approached Sarah about carpentry work of their own. A barn roof out past the Larkin spread a new porch for the Hutchins family, a proper foundation repair for the church itself, damaged for years by water no one had ever properly addressed. "You're going to be busier than James," Mrs. Pruitt observed, watching Sarah measure out the church foundation with her notebook open, now that this whole town's finally worked out what it had sitting right in front of it all along. "I do not mind being busy," Sarah said. "I have spent a great deal of my life with nothing to build. I find I would rather have too much work than too little of it." James, watching from the church steps with Emma beside him, felt something settle deep and permanent in his chest. Watching the woman he loved measure out a foundation for a building that had nothing to do with his own roof. Nothing to do with the debt Crane had nearly used to destroy them. Simply a town, slowly one board and one trust rebuilt at a time, finally seeing in Sarah Miller exactly what he had seen from the very first week when a doubtful offer of no wages and a spare room had somehow turned into the whole of what mattered most in his life. They set the wedding for early spring, once the worst of the Nebraska winter had passed, and the roads were fit for the kind of gathering James wanted. Not a small affair, not anymore, not after everything this town had watched Sarah build and rebuild for it over the past several months, but something the whole of Harlan's Crossing could take part in the way a barn raising or a harvest festival brought a community together around shared work and shared joy in equal measure. Emma appointed herself in charge of decorations, which meant the church Sarah had helped repair was soon draped in more wildflowers than any single 7-year-old should reasonably have been able to gather. And when Sarah tried gently to suggest that perhaps half as many might suffice, Emma looked at her with the particular gravity of a child who had clearly given the matter serious thought. "Papa says a wedding only happens once if you do it right," Emma said. "So I figure it ought to have twice as many flowers as anybody thinks it needs, just to be safe." Sarah laughed, a real laugh. unguarded, the kind she had rarely allowed herself before this town. Before this family had slowly, patiently taught her that laughter did not have to be earned or measured out carefully, that some things were simply allowed to be enjoyed without calculation. "Twice as many flowers, then," she agreed. "I would not dream of arguing with logic that sound." The evening before the wedding, Sarah sat alone in the loft one final time as an unmarried woman, notebook open on her knee, and found herself for the first time in longer than she could remember without the urge to measure anything at all. She simply wrote in slow, careful English a letter she would never send, addressed to a father 4 months in his grave and an ocean away. She told him about the roof, about the storm and the fire and the town that had finally learned to see her clearly, instead of through the fog of its own fear. She told him about James, about his steady hands and his stubborn refusal to let a bank decide what his family was worth, about Emma's fierce, unguarded love, freely given in a way Sarah herself had needed years to learn how to accept. She told him finally that she had found a roof worth staying under, and a family worth building the rest of her life beside, and that she believed wherever he was, now he would have approved of every board she'd nailed and every risk she'd taken to get here. She closed the notebook, set it on the small shelf beside her bed, where it had rested every night since Harlan's Crossing first became something closer to home than any place had felt since Baden, and looked out the small loft window at the roofline silhouetted against a clear, star-filled sky, the same roof that had nearly killed her once, that had held through fire and storm, and a banker's every calculated cruelty standing now exactly as sound and sure as the life she had somehow, against every hard lesson the world had tried to teach her, built beneath it. Tomorrow she would become Sarah Carter. Tonight, one last time, she allowed herself to simply sit with everything she had already built to earn that name, not the roof alone. Though the roof had started it, but the trust, the family, the whole stubborn, hard-won architecture of a life she had once believed she'd have to build entirely alone, and had instead, through nothing but honest work and a refusal to disappear, quietly built, surrounded by people who had finally learned to see exactly what she was worth. The wedding day dawned clear and mild, the kind of gentle spring morning Nebraska rarely offered without demanding something harsher. In exchange first. And by mid-morning, the church Sarah had helped rebuild was filled past its walls. Half the town spilling out onto the steps and into the yard, drawn by an occasion that had somewhere over the past several months stopped being simply James Carter's business and become something the whole of Harlan's Crossing felt a stake in witnessing. Sarah wore a simple dress, unadorned, chosen for the same reason she chose everything, because it was well-made and honest, and did not pretend to be something it wasn't. And when she walked the short aisle toward James, past faces that had once looked at her with suspicion, and now looked at her with nothing but open, unguarded warmth, she found she was not nervous in the way she had expected to be. She was instead simply certain, the way she was certain about a beam that had been properly measured and properly cut. The way she had been certain from the very first day that she knew what a roof was and what it took to build one that held. James waited for her at the front, with Emma standing beside him in a new dress of her own, practically vibrating with excitement, and when Sarah reached them, he took her hands in both of his, steady, now both of them, the shoulder that had once hung useless at his side, finally strong enough to hold her properly. "You came a long way to get here," he said, quiet, just for her, though half the church probably heard it anyway, given how close they were all straining to listen. "I did?" Sarah agreed. "I am glad the road ended here." Reverend Cole spoke the words a small frontier town's pastor had likely spoken 100 times before, about partnership and steadfastness and building a shared life on foundations strong enough to weather whatever storms arrived to test them. And Sarah, listening, thought of ridge beams and rot and the particular satisfaction of work done right the first time, and found the metaphor fit her better than any other blessing could have. When Reverend Cole finally pronounced them married, the church erupted into an applause that felt less like ceremony and more like a town finally fully exhaling after months of tension it hadn't fully realized it was carrying, and Emma threw her arms around both of them at once, laughing, refusing to let either adult have a private moment without her fierce, insistent presence included in it. Outside, the whole town gathered for a celebration that stretched well into the evening tables of food contributed by neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid speaking to Sarah. Fiddle music that had Mrs. Pruitt, of all people, laughing louder than anyone as she attempted a reel. She clearly hadn't danced in decades. Children chasing each other through the churchyard exactly the way Emma had chased her friends the day Sarah first arrived in this town, with nothing but a notebook and a promise to herself. James found Sarah near the edge of it all as the sun went down, watching the whole scene with an expression he hadn't seen her wear before. Not the careful composure she'd guarded so fiercely those first weeks. Not even the quiet contentment of the month since, but something closer to wonder. The particular wonder of a person watching a life come together exactly the way she'd once believed after Baden she would never again be allowed to have one. Regretting any of it yet? He asked, only half joking. Not one bored of it, Sarah said, and pulled him close. And for the first time since a stagecoach had dropped a doubtful stranger into the dust of a town that did not want her, she let herself simply stand still in a life fully finally built with nothing left to fix except the ordinary wonderful work of living it. Later, long after the fiddles had gone quiet and the last of the neighbors had wandered home under a sky thick with stars, the three of them climbed the ladder. One final time that day, the way they had the night they'd celebrated the letter from the county seat, and sat together on the roof that had started everything. The roof that had nearly killed her once, and had instead become the foundation of a whole life neither Sarah nor James had let themselves imagine possible before the other walked into it. "Best day of my whole life," Emma announced, sleepy and satisfied, curled between them. "Mine too," James said, and looked at Sarah, who sat with her new husband's hand in hers, and her whole guarded heart finally fully open to the family she had built it around. "Mine as well," Sarah said quietly, looking out over Harlan's Crossing, over every roof and window and foundation she had touched since the day a stagecoach first left her standing in its dust, and understood with a certainty, deeper than any measurement she had ever taken, that she had not simply found a home in this town. She had built one board by board, trust by trust, out of nothing but her own two hands, and a refusal to let the world decide ever again what she was worth. 3 years passed, the way good years tend to pass quickly and full, and marked less by any single dramatic turn than by the steady accumulation of ordinary days, built well one on top of another, the way Sarah had always built everything that lasted. The workshop that had once belonged to James Carter alone now bore a second name painted fresh beside his on the sign above the door. Carter and Miller Fine Carpentry and Structural Repair. And beneath that sign, on any given morning, a person was as likely to find Sarah directing 3 hired hands through the framing of a new grain elevator as they were to find James finishing cabinet work for a parlor in town. The arrangement had settled naturally, the way good arrangements did between two people who trusted each other's judgment more than their own pride. James still worked his shoulder stronger now than it had been in years, but it was Sarah more often than not who stood at the center of the largest jobs, notebook in hand, directing work that had grown far beyond what either of them could have built alone 8 weeks into a stranger's doubtful hospitality. "You've got the Larkin bid finished?" James asked one morning, finding her at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, a cup of coffee gone cold at her elbow. "Finished and underbid by exactly the amount I calculated the railroad contractor would offer, which means we will win it," Sarah said, not looking up. "I have also finished the specifications for the county's new schoolhouse, which the council approved unanimously last night, a fact Mrs. Pruitt was kind enough to inform me of before the ink on the vote was even dry. Unanimously. Even Hollis's replacement. Even him." Sarah finally looked up, something dry and satisfied in her expression. "It appears a woman who once had her name read aloud in a public meeting as a suspected criminal has 3 years later become the person this county trusts to design its schoolhouse. I find I am still adjusting to the change, James Carter, though I confess I do not dislike it." James crossed the kitchen and kissed the top of her head, a small familiar gesture worn smooth by 3 years of repetition, and glanced toward the doorway, where Emma, now 10 and considerably more opinionated than she'd been at 7, sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching something in a notebook of her own, a habit she'd picked up from Sarah so thoroughly that James sometimes caught himself doing a double take at the sight of it. Mother and daughter bent over their respective pages with the same fierce concentration. "What are you drawing?" he asked her. "A treehouse," Emma said without looking up. "Sarah says the load calculations are wrong on my first design, so I'm fixing them." "She's not wrong to fix them," Sarah said. "A treehouse that falls out of its tree teaches a harder lesson than a corrected drawing does." Emma nodded with the particular gravity of a child who had absorbed over 3 years an entire philosophy of craftsmanship along with her carpentry lessons, and bent back over her notebook. Tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, and James watched the two of them with the same quiet, permanent wonder that had settled into his chest the day he watched Sarah measure out a church foundation and understood fully what his family had become. The railroad bid, when it finally came down to a decision, did not go quite as smoothly as Sarah's calculations had promised. A rival firm arrived from Omaha 3 days before the county's final decision, sent by the railroad's regional office to inspect the competing bids in person, and the man leading them, a sharp-suited contractor named Walter Hargrove, with the particular polish of someone who had never once had to prove himself twice for the same job, made his opinion of the situation clear within minutes of stepping off the train. "You're telling me," Hargrove said, standing in the workshop yard with the county surveyor and 2 of his own men looking between James and Sarah, with an expression that made no effort to hide its skepticism, that the low bid on a load-bearing rail trestle came from a firm run out of a carpentry shop by a woman. "Co-run," James said evenly. "And yes, with respect, Mr. Carter, a grain elevator is one thing. A rail trestle carrying loaded freight cars is an entirely different order of engineering. I'd hate to see this county's money wasted on a bid that looks good on paper and fails under real weight." Sarah, who had been reviewing blueprints at the work table through this entire exchange, finally set down her pencil and looked up. "Mr. Hargrove, my bid includes load calculations for the trestle that exceed your own firm's specifications by a margin of 12%. Precisely because I have seen firsthand what happens when a structure is built to the minimum standard rather than the standard that accounts for a hard winter, an unexpected storm, or simple human error in the loading. I did not arrive at those numbers by guessing. I arrived at them by 20 years of understanding exactly how wood and iron fail when they are asked to bear more than they were built for. 20 years is a generous accounting for a woman your age. I built my first roof at 11. Sarah said, without heat, simply stating the fact the way she stated every fact. I have been doing this work considerably longer than you appear willing to credit me for, Mr. Hargrove, and I find that the surest way to discover whether a bridge holds is very rarely to argue about it in a yard. It is to test it. The county surveyor, a quiet, careful man named Mr. Doyle, who had said little through the whole exchange, finally spoke up. There's a partial trestle section already up at the crossing site, built by the previous contractor before he pulled out of the job. If Mrs. Carter's confident in her numbers, perhaps the fairest way to settle this is to let both firms demonstrate their assessment of it directly, rather than argue specifications in a yard. Hargrove's mouth twitched unhappy, but unable to find graceful grounds to refuse a suggestion that sounded on its surface entirely reasonable. Fine by me. Sarah looked at James, something sharp and ready, moving behind her eyes, the same look she'd worn the first week she arrived in this town, climbing a ladder before sunrise, to prove, silently and without argument, exactly what she was capable of. Then let us go look at a bridge. The crossing site sat 2 miles outside town, a half-finished trestle spanning a dry creek bed that would run fast and dangerous come spring. And the partial structure the previous contractor had abandoned stood exposed to full inspection, every joint and support visible to anyone willing to climb up and look closely. Sarah climbed first without waiting for an invitation, moving up the scaffolding with the same sure economical grace she'd carried up James's ladder years before, and Hargrove, unwilling to be shown up by a woman in front of the county surveyor, followed close behind with rather less grace and considerably more visible effort. "Here," Sarah said, crouching at a joint roughly a third of the way across the span, running her hand along a support beam with the same careful attention she gave every piece of wood that crossed her path. This joint was cut against the grain rather than with it. It will hold under light load, but under the weight of a loaded freight car in freezing temperatures when the wood contracts unevenly, This is exactly the kind of joint that fails first. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, invisibly. The way rot spreads in a roof no one thinks to inspect until it's too late. Hargrove examined this joint himself, and something flickered across his face that he clearly hadn't expected to feel the reluctant respect of a professional, recognizing another professional's eye, however much his pride resisted admitting it out loud. You're saying the previous contractor's whole design is compromised. I am saying this joint is compromised, and I would need to inspect the rest of the span before I could speak to the whole design. But if a builder makes this mistake once out of haste or ignorance, he has very likely made it more than once. Sarah moved further along the beam, testing 3 more joints in quick succession, her hands moving with a fluency that came from decades of exactly this kind of work. Here, and here. Both cut the same way. Whoever built this trestle was working quickly, Mr. Hargrove, and quickly is not always the same as correctly. Doyle, watching from the ground with a notebook of his own, called up, Mrs. Carter. If you were awarded this contract, how would you address the existing compromised sections? I would not simply patch them, Sarah called back down. I would replace every joint of this type across the full span regardless of the additional cost, because a bridge is not the kind of structure where a person gambles on a joint, holding one more season. I built my reputation in this county, learning that lesson the hard way on a roof that nearly killed me because I trusted a beam I had not yet learned to fully inspect. I do not intend to make that same mistake on a structure carrying loaded freight cars over a creek bed. Hargrove, to his credit, did not argue further. He climbed back down in silence and stood beside his own men for a long moment, looking up at the joint Sarah had identified. And when he finally spoke again, some of the earlier condescension had drained entirely out of his voice. My firm's bid didn't account for a full rebuild of the compromised sections. He admitted to Doyle, rather than to Sarah, directly, though everyone present understood exactly who the admission was truly meant for. If she's right about the extent of it, and I'd need my own inspection to say for certain, her bid may actually be the more honest one, whatever it costs the county up front. I am right about it, Sarah said, climbing back down herself, brushing sawdust from her hands with brisk efficiency. You are welcome to conduct your own inspection, Mr. Hargrove. I suspect you will find exactly what I found. I do not build my numbers on hope. I build them on 20 years of watching wood fail and learning every single time exactly what it looks like before it does. The county awarded the contract to Carter and Miller 11 days later, and Doyle, delivering the news himself, admitted with some amusement that Hargrove's own inspection had confirmed every one of Sarah's findings down to the joint. He wasn't happy about it, Doyle said. But I'll say this for the man. Once he saw the truth of it laid out plain, he didn't waste breath arguing against it. Told me on his way back to the train that he'd be recommending Carter and Miller to 2 other counties, considering rail work next year. Called you the most thorough carpenter he's inspected work alongside in 15 years of railroad contracts. High praise coming from a man who walked in here fairly certain he already knew how this would go. Sarah accepted the news with the same measured composure she accepted most things. Though James caught the small private smile she allowed herself once Doyle had ridden off the particular satisfaction of a woman who had spent her whole life being doubted at first glance, and had once again simply let the work answer the doubt more thoroughly than any argument could. The trestle took the better part of a year to build properly, and Sarah oversaw nearly every joint of it herself, training a rotating crew of local men in the exacting standards she refused to compromise on. And it was during that year that she took on her first formal apprentice. A quiet, sharp-eyed girl of 16 named Ruth Kowalski, the daughter of Polish immigrants who ran a struggling dairy farm outside town, who had shown up at the workshop one morning, asking without preamble whether a girl could learn carpentry the same way a boy could. Why do you want to learn? Sarah asked her the same question she'd once been asked by nobody, because nobody in Baden had ever thought to ask a girl why she wanted to build things they had simply assumed she didn't, until she proved otherwise with her hands. Because my father's dairy barn is falling down, and he can't afford to hire it fixed, Ruth said. And because I watched you climb that trestle scaffolding faster than any of Hargrove's men, and I want to know how a person gets that good at something everybody assumes she can't do. Sarah studied the girl for a long moment, seeing in her the same flat, stubborn certainty she remembered wearing herself stepping off a stagecoach 8 years ago, with nothing but a notebook and a refusal to let the world's assumptions decide her worth for her. "Good hands are not the same as trained hands," Sarah said, echoing almost word for word what she'd once told a 7-year-old Emma over a bent nail and a scrap of wood. "But trained hands begin somewhere. Show up tomorrow at sunrise. We will see what you are made of." Ruth showed up the next morning before Sarah herself had finished her coffee, and within a year she had become one of the steadiest hands in the growing Carter and Miller crew. The first of what would eventually become half a dozen young women from across the county who arrived at the workshop door asking some version of the same question Ruth had asked, drawn by the same quiet, undeniable proof of what was possible, once somebody simply refused to accept that a person's size or accent or gender settled the matter of what they were capable of building. The storm that nearly undid all of it came in late autumn, 8 months into the trestle's construction, and it arrived with almost no warning at all. A sudden violent squall line racing up from the south, while half the crew was still 40 feet up on the unfinished span, securing the last of the cross braces before the season's first hard freeze. "Get everyone down now," Sarah shouted, already moving toward the scaffolding herself, despite the wind beginning to whip loose gravel across the creek bed. "Ruth, count heads as they come down. I want every single man off that span before the lightning gets close enough to matter." The crew scrambled down in the controlled chaos of people who had drilled this exact scenario more than once under Sarah's insistence. But one man, a newer hand named Cooper, barely 3 weeks into the job, froze halfway down his foot, caught in a gap between planks, panic locking his whole body rigid as the wind picked up around him. "I can't." Cooper's voice cracked thin and frightened against the rising howl of the storm. "My foot's stuck. I can't get it loose." Without hesitation, Sarah went back up, climbing against the wind with the same sure, economical grace that had carried her up a different roof through a different storm 8 years before, and reached Cooper just as the first heavy drops began to fall. "Look at me," she said, close enough now to be heard over the wind, her hands already working at the gap trapping his boot. "Not down, not at the ground, at me. I have done this before, Cooper. I am not losing a man on this bridge. I'm sorry I panicked. I just froze." Panic is not weakness. Panic that keeps you from acting is the only problem, and we are fixing that right now. She freed his boot with a sharp practice twist and half-guided, half-hauled him toward the ladder, both of them soaked through within seconds as the storm broke fully overhead. "Down, now. I am right behind you." They reached the ground together just as lightning split the sky close enough to rattle the whole crew's nerves, and Ruth, counting heads with the fierce concentration Sarah had trained into her over the past year, called out the final tally with visible relief. "Everyone's down. Everyone's accounted for." Sarah stood in the driving rain chest, heaving, watching the half-finished trestle hold steady against a wind that would have tested it to its limits had it been complete, and felt for one suspended moment the full weight of every year that had brought her to exactly this storm, exactly this crew, exactly this structure, standing solid against weather, that had once nearly taken her life on a much smaller roof in a much smaller town, when she had still been nothing more than a doubtful stranger. Nobody expected to survive the season. "You went back up for him," James said later, once the storm had passed and the whole crew had gathered soaked and shaken, but whole in the shelter of the half-built workshed near the site. "Didn't hesitate for a second." "I did not hesitate because I did not need to," Sarah said. "I have spent my whole life learning exactly what a person can survive if they simply keep their hands moving instead of letting fear freeze them in place." I was not about to let Cooper learn that lesson the hard way, on my bridge under my watch. Cooper, still pale but steadier now, approached her once the crew began dispersing toward dry clothes and hot coffee. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. I mean it. I thought—" "You do not need to thank me," Sarah said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "You need to show up tomorrow and finish the cross bracing you started today. That is the only thanks I require. A man who quits after one bad storm was never going to make it as a bridge builder anyway, and I do not believe watching you work these past 3 weeks that you are that kind of man." Cooper nodded, something steadier settling into his face, and Sarah turned back toward the half-finished span standing solid against a clearing sky, already calculating out of long habit exactly how many days the delay would cost them, and exactly how they would make the time back up before the ground froze too hard to work. A letter arrived from Germany the following spring, forwarded through 3 different addresses, before it finally found its way to the Carter property, and Sarah recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she'd even fully registered why it felt familiar. Careful, formal, the hand of someone writing in a second language they had worked hard to master. She opened it at the kitchen table with James watching curious, and read it through twice before she trusted her voice enough to explain. "It is from the magistrate's office in Baden," she said slowly. "The report against me, the assault charge that was never formally pursued, has been officially closed. Struck from the record entirely. It seems the bank agent I struck, the one who tried to move my father's body before I was ready to let it go, has spent the years since leaving the bank's employ and has apparently, according to this letter, made something of a project out of advocating for reformed eviction practices." He wrote a statement himself included with the magistrate's letter, saying he had come to understand with time that what he did that morning was cruel, regardless of what the law technically permitted, and that he did not believe the report should remain standing against a grieving daughter defending her father's dignity. James set down his coffee, watching her carefully. "How do you feel about that?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, turning the letter over in her hands, feeling the particular strange weight of a wound she had carried for nearly a decade, finally unexpectedly being allowed to close. "I do not know that I ever expected an apology from that direction," she said finally. "I built my whole life since that morning on the assumption that I would simply have to carry it unresolved the way I carried my father's death, and the loss of his shop, a wound I learned to work around, rather than one I ever expected to heal cleanly." She looked up at James, something moving behind her eyes that was equal parts old grief and new, unexpected peace. "I find I am glad of it regardless. Not because I needed his forgiveness to know I did the right thing that morning, but because it means the story no longer follows me the way it once did. Crane could not use it as a weapon again, even if he tried. There is nothing left to weaponize. Does this change anything about staying, I mean? You could go back now if you wanted. Reclaim whatever's left of your father's name in Baden." Sarah looked around the kitchen at the ring on her finger, worn smooth now by years of daily wear, at Emma's carpentry sketches pinned to the wall beside the window, at the man across the table who had offered a stranger a room and no wages 8 years ago, and had somehow patiently built an entire life together with her out of that doubtful beginning. "There is nothing left in Baden that I want to reclaim," she said. "My father's shop belongs to someone else now, has for years, and I do not believe reclaiming a building would give me back what the bank actually took from me. What I lost in Baden was not a building, James. It was the belief that I would ever be allowed to build something and keep it without a stranger's paperwork deciding otherwise." She folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "I already found that here. I do not need Baden to give me back what I have already built for myself in this kitchen on that trestle in this town that finally learned to see me clearly instead of through its own fear." The trestle was finished by early summer, the final joint driven home in a small ceremony. The whole county turned out for railroad officials from Omaha, standing alongside farmers and shopkeepers and the same men who had once whispered doubts about a foreign woman's papers, now applauding as the first loaded freight car crossed the span without so much as a tremor in the structure beneath it. Hargrove himself made the trip out from Omaha for the occasion, and sought Sarah out afterward with something that looked on his composed professional face almost like genuine respect. "I've recommended your firm for 2 more contracts this year alone," he said. "Larger jobs than this one. There's a bridge outside Lincoln that's going to need exactly the kind of thorough work you did here, and a rail yard expansion in Kansas that could use a firm willing to build to the standard rather than the minimum." "I appreciate the recommendation," Sarah said. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Carter. I walked into that yard 3 years back, fully expecting to find a bid I could pick apart within the hour. I've inspected a great many contractors in 15 years of railroad work, and I've rarely met one man or woman who builds with the kind of discipline you bring to every joint. This county got lucky having you settle here instead of somewhere else." Sarah considered the compliment with the same careful weight she gave everything, and found somewhat to her own surprise that she believed it not out of vanity, but out of the same plain-earned certainty she'd carried since the day she first climbed James's ladder and told a doubtful stranger she knew what a roof was. "I did not settle here by luck, Mr. Hargrove," she said. "I settled here because a man offered a stranger a fair trade when the whole rest of the world was inclined to offer her nothing at all, and because a town eventually chose to judge me by my work instead of my size or my accent." Luck had very little to do with it. It was simply people here and there choosing to see clearly instead of choosing fear. I have found that is the whole of what separates a town that thrives from one that does not. By the time Emma turned 18, Carter and Miller had grown into the largest carpentry and structural firm in 3 counties, employing over 20 hands across half a dozen active projects at any given time. More than half of them women. Ruth, or Sarah herself, had personally trained women who had shown up at the workshop door, the same way Ruth once had, asking some version of the same stubborn question about whether a girl could learn to build things the same way a boy could. Emma herself had grown into precisely the kind of carpenter her upbringing had promised. Sharp-eyed, exacting, impatient with sloppy work in a way that made James laugh every time he watched her correct a hired hand's joint with the exact same flat, patient certainty Sarah had used to correct her own crooked nails a decade before. "You're going to run this place someday," James told her, watching her direct a crew through the framing of a new grain warehouse on the edge of town, 18 years old, and entirely unbothered by the fact that half her crew was twice her age. "You know that." "I know it," Emma said without looking up from her measurements. "Sarah's been training me for it since I was 7. I just didn't understand back then that learning to drive a nail straight was really her, teaching me how to build a whole life." James looked at his daughter, steady, capable, utterly unafraid of a world that had once seemed determined to convince a large foreign carpenter that she had no right to the ladder she climbed, and felt the particular permanent pride of a man watching everything he loved most prove decisively that it had been built to last. On a quiet evening not long after Sarah climbed the ladder to the original roof one more time, the first one, the one that had started everything still standing solid over the workshop where James had first offered a doubtful stranger a room and no wages in exchange for a job nobody else believed she could finish. She climbed alone this time, notebook in hand, out of old habit, though she no longer needed to measure anything, to know exactly how sound the structure beneath her remained. James found her there, as the sun went down, the same way he had years before, and settled beside her without a word. The two of them looking out over a town that had grown considerably in the years since new buildings rising at the edges. Half of them built or repaired by hands. Sarah had personally trained a schoolhouse and a church foundation and a rail trestle 2 miles east, all standing as quiet testament to a life built patiently out of nothing but honest work and a refusal to disappear. "Ruth's asking about opening a second shop," James said. "Over in Beatrice. Says there's demand enough for it and she's ready to run one herself." "She is ready," Sarah agreed. "I have thought so for over a year now. I was only waiting for her to believe it herself." That'll make 3 counties with a Carter and Miller trained carpenter working in them. 4, if you count the girl Emma's training out at the Larkin place. Sarah smiled, small and private, looking out at the darkening horizon. "I did not set out to build any of this, James. I only wanted a roof over my head, and a reason to keep my hands moving after Baden took everything else from me. I did not understand back then that fixing one roof honestly enough would eventually mean fixing 100, or that teaching one frightened girl to drive a nail straight would eventually mean teaching dozens more that their hands were capable of more than the world had ever bothered to tell them. Does it feel like enough? Everything you built?" Sarah considered the question with the same careful weight she gave every important thing, looking out over a town that had once wanted nothing to do with her, and now stood in more ways than either of them could easily count, built partly out of her own 2 hands. "It does not feel like an ending," she said finally. "It feels like a foundation. There is still a great deal of work left undone in this county. James and I intend to spend whatever years I have left doing it alongside a family I did not know 8 years ago that I would ever be lucky enough to have." She looked at him, at the roof beneath them, at the whole stubborn architecture of a life built one honest board at a time. I came to this country believing I would have to build everything alone, the way I had been forced to in Baden. I have learned instead that the strongest thing a person can build is not a roof or a bridge or even a business. It is the kind of trust that lets other people build alongside you long after you are gone in rooms and towns you will never live to see. Emma's own daughter, born the following spring, and named Sarah after the grandmother who had taught her mother to drive a nail. True, grew up climbing the same ladder her mother and grandmother had climbed before her. And by the time she was 7, she had already announced with the same flat, unshakable certainty that seemed to run through every woman in that family that she intended to build bridges even bigger than the one out past the creek crossing. Bigger than that one. James asked her once, delighted watching his granddaughter sketch elaborate, wildly impractical designs on scraps of butcher paper the same way Emma once had. Much bigger, young Sarah said, entirely serious. Grandma Sarah says a person should never build small just because everybody expects them to. James looked across the yard to where the elder Sarah stood gray now at the temples, but no less steady in her bearing, directing a new crew of apprentices through the framing of yet another barn roof, and felt the particular quiet joy of a man watching a lesson pass cleanly down through 3 generations of women who had never once needed anyone's permission to build exactly as large as they intended to. Years later, long after the trestle had carried 1,000 loaded freight cars safely across that creek bed, long after Ruth's second shop in Beatrice had grown into a business every bit as respected as the original, long after Emma had married a quiet, steady rancher's son and taken over the whole of Carter and Miller with the same fierce, exacting competence she'd shown at 18, Sarah Miller Carter would sometimes still find herself thinking of a churchyard in Germany, of a gravedigger's flat, indifferent voice telling her that the plot beside her father had already been sold to pay his debts, of the particular cold certainty she had carried onto that harbor ship, believing she would spend the whole of her life proving her worth to strangers, who had already decided before she ever lifted a hammer exactly how little she deserved. She had been wrong about that in the end, though it had taken an ocean, a stagecoach, a doubtful carpenter's desperate offer, and a roof that very nearly killed her before it taught her exactly how much a person's worth could be measured by the work of their own 2 hands rather than by anyone else's fear of what those hands looked like. She had not simply survived Harlan's Crossing. She had built it into something sturdier, board by board, trust by trust, the same patient way she had once reinforced a beam 3 days before anyone else believed it needed reinforcing. The gravedigger in Baden had been right about one thing in his own indifferent way. There had been no plot waiting for her beside her father's grave, but there had been waiting an ocean away in a town that did not yet know. It needed her an entire life worth building, instead a husband who had trusted her with his family before the whole town trusted her with anything at all. A daughter who had learned to drive a nail straight, and in doing so, learned that her own hands were capable of far more than the world was inclined to promise a girl of any size, and a legacy of trained hands and honest roofs spreading out across 3 counties, and counting each one, standing as quiet, permanent proof that the woman the world had once been so ready to throw away had instead patiently and without asking anyone's permission built an empire, not of stone and not of money, though there was plenty of both by then. An empire of skill nobody could any longer ignore, carried forward in the hands of every apprentice who had ever shown up doubting herself, and left certain the way Sarah herself had once been, certain standing in a stranger's yard with nothing but a notebook and a promise that no man, no bank, and no fear would ever again decide what she was worth. Mrs. Pruitt, well into her 80s by then, and still fond of reminding anyone who would listen that she had known Sarah Miller was something special, long before the rest of the town caught up. Liked to tell the story of the fence at every church gathering for the better part of 2 decades. How a woman she'd once judged on sight had fixed a leaning fence for nothing but the asking, and taught the whole of Harlan's Crossing, one honest board at a time, exactly how wrong first impressions could be when fear was allowed to right them. She had come to Harlan's Crossing with nothing but a roof to finish. She left behind, when her own long life finally reached its end, many years later, a foundation. The whole county still stood on schoolhouses and bridges and barns and homes, numbering well past 100. Every one of them touched by hands she had trained, or trained herself, every one of them proof plain and undeniable as a beam that held through every storm sent to test it, that the people the world is quickest to underestimate are very often the ones who end up building everything that lasts. The roof James Carter had once offered a stranger in exchange for nothing, but her labor still stood decades on, tight and true, against every winter that came to test it exactly as sound as the day Sarah Miller drove the final nail home and told a doubtful town that a roof's failure was never a matter of luck, only of whether the hands that built it had cared enough to build it right the first time. She had cared. She had never once stopped caring. Not through storm, not through fire, not through every doubt a frightened world had tried to plant in her path. And in the end, that was the whole of what made an empire out of a woman nobody had expected to matter at all.